Booker T. Washington, born into the harsh reality of slavery in 1856, would go on to become one of the most influential African-American leaders of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His life story unfolds against the backdrop of a nation in transformation, from the end of the Civil War to the dawn of the 20th century. Washington rose from humble beginnings to establish the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, shaping a vision for African-American education that would endure for generations. His legacy is rooted in his belief that education, particularly vocational training, was the key to empowerment for Black Americans. Through his work, he became a symbol of progress and resilience in a time of deep racial segregation and economic hardship. His philosophy of self-reliance, which emphasized hard work and patience, would influence the trajectory of African-American leadership for decades to come. As we journey through his life, we will explore the pivotal moments and enduring lessons that define Booker T. Washington's contributions. May this quiet reflection of his story offer both understanding and peace, as we delve into the life of a man whose vision helped shape the course of history. Before we begin, remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share where you're listening from. Now let us begin this gentle exploration of Booker T. Washington's life. Booker T. Washington's journey began in a time of deep societal division and oppression. In a small rural cabin on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia, born into slavery on April 5, 1856, Washington was the son of an enslaved woman, Jane, and an unknown white father. His early years were spent under the cruel and dehumanizing institution of slavery, a period that would deeply influence his later philosophy and life's work. Life on the plantation was grueling. Washington, like many enslaved children, had no access to formal education. He was raised alongside his mother and siblings, without the luxuries and privileges that many children of the time experienced. His mother, though bound by the constraints of slavery, was a strong and determined figure in his life. She did what she could to care for her children, instilling in them the resilience needed to survive such harsh conditions. As a young boy, Washington worked alongside his mother in the fields, toiling under the relentless sun. His early memories were marked by long days of hard labor, the constant struggle for survival, and the ever-present threat of violence. Yet, even in these circumstances, he remembered moments of quiet resistance, where his mother, though limited in power, encouraged him to find a hope in small victories. Though his formal education was prohibited, Booker learned to read and write in secret. The desire for knowledge was strong in him from a young age, and he was curious about everything around him. The reading he managed to do, despite the oppressive atmosphere of his childhood, would serve as a foundation for his future. One of the earliest memories of learning was his ability to read simple words in the books his mother kept hidden. These moments of personal discovery would fuel his drive for education throughout his life. The end of the Civil War in 1865 brought about significant changes for Washington and his family. The war itself was a turning point in American history, marking the end of slavery and the beginning of Reconstruction. Washington, just a child at the time, experienced the freedom that came with the Confederacy's surrender. However, the transition from slavery to freedom was not without its own challenges. In many ways, freedom was a concept difficult to grasp for someone like Washington, who had known only servitude. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Washington's family found themselves with new opportunities, but also new obstacles. The Southern economy had been shattered, and many former slaves were left without land, resources, or means of support. Washington's mother worked tirelessly to support her children, but their circumstances remained difficult. While freedom had brought a glimmer of hope, it was accompanied by profound uncertainty. During this time, Booker was able to experience the beginning of his educational journey. The first formal education he received came when he was nearly a teenager. A freedman, or former slave, named Mrs. Ruffner opened a small school nearby. She took it upon herself to teach the children in the area, including Washington. The experience of being able to attend school, even briefly, marked a turning point in his life. It was there that he developed a passion for learning, a passion that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Washington's early experiences in slavery and the immediate aftermath of the Civil War were formative in his development. They shaped his understanding of the world and his place within it. The hardships he faced in his youth gave him a deep appreciation for the value of education. It also instilled in him a profound sense of determination. Even in the face of overwhelming adversity, he believed that education could be a means of liberation and empowerment. He once described his early years as a struggle to find meaning, a struggle to find a way to lift himself out of the poverty and hardship that defined his existence. This struggle would shape the core of his philosophy. He came to see the pursuit of knowledge not just as a personal goal, but as a collective one, a path toward improving the lives of all African Americans, particularly in the South. As he grew older, Washington moved to the town of Malden, West Virginia, where he worked for a time as a houseboy. The work, though arduous, allowed him to continue his education. He often took advantage of any opportunity to learn, whether it was by attending evening classes or reading whatever books he could find. It was during these years that he developed a sense of self-worth that would later become central to his leadership. Washington's early life was defined by struggle, but also by the resilience and hope he carried within him. He was a child shaped by the harshest circumstances, but one who refused to accept defeat. He saw his education as a key to unlocking not only his potential, but the potential of his people. The lessons learned during his early years, the value of hard work, the importance of knowledge, and the necessity of perseverance, became the foundation of his later successes. Though Washington's early life was filled with hardship, it was also filled with moments of quiet defiance. Despite the odds, he never gave up on the idea that he could change his own fate, and, by extension, the fate of his people. The memory of his early struggles, particularly those in his youth, stayed with him throughout his life, reminding him of the importance of self-reliance and the power of education. It is this early, difficult period of Booker T, Washington's life, that laid the groundwork for the man he would become, a man who would rise above the hardships of his youth to become a leader in the fight for African American empowerment, an advocate for education, and a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. The end of the Civil War in 1865 brought a profound shift in the landscape of the United States, and for Booker T. Washington, it marked the dawn of a new chapter in his life. At the time, Washington was only 9 years old, yet the war's conclusion would shape the course of his future in ways that would resonate throughout his lifetime. The Emancipation Proclamation, which had been issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were to be set free. Yet, despite this, freedom did not come immediately for Washington and the millions of others who were enslaved across the South. When the war ended and General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, the Confederacy collapsed, and slavery was formally abolished with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. For Booker, this moment was not only a political turning point but also a deeply personal one. It represented the first true taste of freedom that he and his family had ever known. The shackles of bondage were gone, but the road ahead was uncertain, and the full meaning of emancipation was yet to be understood. Despite being free from the chains of slavery, Washington's family, like many newly freed people, found themselves in a difficult situation. The South's economy had been devastated by years of war, and while slavery had been abolished, the promises of freedom and prosperity were not immediately fulfilled. Many African Americans, including Booker's family, struggled to find work, land, and a means of sustenance in the post-war South. In many ways, the end of the war opened up a new set of challenges, as former slaves had to navigate a world that had not yet fully embraced the concept of equality. For Washington's mother, Jane, the task of raising her children in this new world was daunting. She worked tirelessly to support Booker and his siblings, but the family remained poor. Booker, now a free child, began to understand the complexities of freedom. freedom from slavery did not guarantee freedom from poverty, prejudice, or hardship. Washington would later reflect on these early post-emancipation years, recognizing the harsh realities faced by African Americans in the South, even after slavery ended. Despite this, Washington's mother emphasized the importance of education, and it became a key part of Booker's vision for his own life. He later credited his mother for teaching him the value of hard work and perseverance, even when faced with daunting obstacles. With the end of the Civil War, the opportunities for education for black people began to slowly improve. Although public schools were not immediately available to African Americans in many parts of the South, new educational institutions for freedmen were being established. Washington's determination to learn and to make the most of the opportunities available to him was unwavering. Despite the lack of formal schooling for African American children in the South, Booker made his own way. He enrolled in a school in Malden, West Virginia, and later attended the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia, where his real educational journey began. It was at Hampton that Booker T. Washington first encountered the idea that would shape his later work: education as a path to self-improvement and empowerment. At Hampton, Booker learned that education was not just about reading and writing, but about preparing individuals to be self-sufficient and contributing members of society. Washington's personal belief in education as a means of progress, not just for himself but for the entire African American community, was shaped by the experiences he had during the Reconstruction period. However, for many African Americans, freedom was an uncertain concept. Even after the Civil War, deeply entrenched systems of racial prejudice continued to hold sway in the South. Washington's early years of freedom were marred by the persistence of racism, segregation, and inequality. These societal constraints would become a central theme in Washington's life's work, as he sought to uplift his people through education and self-reliance, rather than through direct confrontation with a deeply divided society. Although Booker was young at the time, the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment would stay with him throughout his life. They were the foundation of his belief that the right to education was inseparable from the right to freedom. Washington saw that education, particularly a practical, vocational education, was not just a way to escape the bonds of slavery, but also a means of self-determination and empowerment for newly freed African Americans. As Washington grew older, the challenges of this new world were evident. While African Americans had been granted freedom, their full rights as citizens were still denied in many parts of the country. The effects of Reconstruction were inconsistent, and the period that followed, known as the Jim Crow era, would introduce even more severe racial segregation and discrimination. Booker T. Washington, however, did not see these challenges as insurmountable. Instead, they fueled his determination to build institutions that would provide African Americans with the tools they needed to succeed. Though his path was difficult, Washington's perseverance never wavered. The freedom that came with the end of slavery was just the beginning of a long journey for Booker T. Washington and his people, a journey that would take years, if not generations, to fully realize. Yet, despite the obstacles, Washington remained steadfast in his belief that education could provide the key to the upliftment of his people. Through the lessons of his early years in slavery and freedom, Booker T. Washington developed a deep understanding of the importance of education and self-sufficiency. His experiences during the post-war period, both as a child of newly freed slaves and as an adult working toward educational reform, helped him develop a clear vision of the future for African Americans, a future that could be built on hard work, perseverance, and an unwavering belief in the power of education. As Booker T. Washington transitioned from childhood into young adulthood, the path to education was not an easy one. His early experiences with education were born from a deep hunger for knowledge, a hunger that was first awakened during the period of emancipation. Yet, despite the promise of freedom, the opportunities for formal schooling were few and far between for African Americans in the South, especially for those like Washington, who had been born into slavery. Washington's journey to formal education began with a profound belief that learning would be the key to his own success and the key to the betterment of his people. After the Civil War, he found himself in West Virginia, where he began his education at a local school. As a young boy, he attended classes at night, often in makeshift schools that had sprung up in response to the newly freed population's thirst for education. It was in these early experiences that Washington learned the value of perseverance. Attending school while working long hours in menial jobs was no small feat, but Washington's commitment to his education never wavered. In 1872, Washington moved to Hampton, Virginia, to attend the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute, a pivotal moment in his life. At Hampton, he was exposed to new ideas and experiences that would shape his future career in philosophy. It was there, under the guidance of Samuel Chapman Armstrong, a former Union soldier who became the head of the institution, that Washington first encountered the philosophy that would later become central to his work: the idea that vocational and industrial education would be the foundation upon which African Americans could build their futures. Armstrong's influence on Washington was profound. Armstrong believed in practical, hands-on learning that would prepare young African Americans for self-sufficiency. His belief that the black community's success would depend on mastering practical trades, such as carpentry, farming, and other skilled labor, resonated deeply with Washington. This philosophy was a stark contrast to the academic models of education that were typically reserved for white students. Armstrong's teachings emphasized the importance of economic self-reliance and discipline, values that would become cornerstones of Washington's own educational approach. While Washington was deeply influenced by Armstrong's ideas, it was his own experiences at Hampton that helped him understand the transformative power of education. As a student, Washington was determined to excel. He took full advantage of the resources at Hampton, eagerly participating in both academic and practical lessons. Despite facing initial obstacles, including financial hardships and the difficulty of being a latecomer to formal schooling, Washington's determination led to academic success. One of the most formative experiences of Washington's time at Hampton occurred when he was tasked with cleaning the school's buildings as part of his work-study program. Although it was a menial task, Washington took pride in his work, understanding that every act, no matter how small, was an opportunity to demonstrate discipline and responsibility. It was during this time that Washington's understanding of hard work as a means of self-improvement deepened. He saw that education was not just about acquiring knowledge, it was about developing character and work ethic. Upon graduating from Hampton in 1875, Washington found himself faced with the challenge of finding work that would allow him to continue his education and put his newfound knowledge to use. In the years that followed, Washington would teach at various schools for black children. He would also come into contact with leaders and philanthropists who would later become integral to his mission of establishing an educational institution for African Americans. During these early years of his career, Washington refined his educational philosophy and deepened his belief that vocational training was crucial for the upliftment of black Americans. In 1881, Washington's dream of creating his own school began to take shape when he founded the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama. With limited resources and few supporters, the establishment of Tuskegee was a daunting task. However, Washington's experiences in both education and his formative years at Hampton had prepared him for this challenge. He applied the lessons he had learned about practical skills, work ethic, and self-reliance to build an institution that would serve as a model for African American education. Tuskegee was not just a school, it was a vision that sought to provide young black students with the tools they needed to succeed in the world. Washington's approach emphasized the importance of both intellectual and manual labor. He believed that African Americans needed to be equipped not only with academic knowledge, but also with practical skills that would allow them to thrive in the labor market. Tuskegee's curriculum was designed to provide students with the skills they would need to secure employment and contribute to the economic prosperity of their communities. Washington's emphasis on industrial education was rooted in his belief that economic independence would be the key to gaining respect and equality for African Americans. He understood that in the context of post-Reconstruction America, social equality would be difficult to achieve if African Americans were not economically self-sufficient. Therefore, he focused on educating students in trades like carpentry, agriculture, and domestic skills. These practical skills were seen as essential to the economic success of black communities, and Washington's efforts to provide such an education became one of the cornerstones of his leadership. Despite his success in establishing Tuskegee, Washington's philosophy did not come without its critics. Some, like W.E.B. Du Bois, believed that Washington's emphasis on vocational training was too limited, and that African Americans should strive for higher education and political engagement. Du Bois and others in the emerging intellectual class argued that Washington's approach would keep African Americans in a subservient position, as it focused more on accommodating the existing social order rather than challenging it. However, Washington remained steadfast in his belief that, for most black Americans in the South, vocational education was the most practical and effective way to improve their lives. Washington's formative experiences at Hampton and his own challenges in obtaining an education shaped the way he viewed the world. His philosophy of education was not just about intellectual achievement, but about the holistic development of a person. He saw education as a means of transforming individuals, not just through academic knowledge, but through the development of character, discipline, and practical skills. As the years passed, Washington's influence grew, and his educational model gained recognition. Tuskegee became a beacon of hope for African Americans in the South, and Washington's name became synonymous with the idea of uplifting black communities through education and self-reliance. The principles he learned during his time at Hampton and the lessons of his own difficult journey toward education were reflected in the work he did at Tuskegee. His vision for the future of African Americans was rooted in the belief that education, work ethic, and perseverance would ultimately lead to a more just and equal society. Booker T. Washington's life was marked by a series of critical decisions and major milestones that not only defined his personal journey, but also shaped the future of African American education and empowerment. These decisions were made in the context of a rapidly changing America, a nation still reeling from the Civil War and struggling to define its racial and social dynamics in the wake of emancipation. Washington's understanding of his role within this broader societal shift helped him navigate the complexities of leadership in an era defined by racial segregation and inequality. In 1881, Washington made one of the most significant decisions of his life. He accepted the position to lead the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama. The school was still in its infancy, and Washington took on the daunting task of turning it into a world-class institution, despite having few resources and little financial support. This was a pivotal moment, as Washington was determined to create a school that would offer African Americans, particularly those in the South, a practical education that would prepare them for real-world success. From the outset, Washington's vision for Tuskegee was clear. He sought to create an institution that would teach students not only academic knowledge, but also practical skills in agriculture, trades, and industrial work. In doing so, Washington's model of education was centered on self-reliance and self-sufficiency, believing that economic independence would be the key to African American advancement. His commitment to vocational education was, in many ways, his response to the harsh realities of post-Reconstruction America, where opportunities for African Americans were limited and racial prejudice was deeply entrenched. Tuskegee was, at its core, a practical school designed to provide African Americans with the tools necessary to build their own livelihoods. Washington believed that by equipping his students with these skills, they would be able to rise above the economic hardships they faced and gain the respect of white Americans. The curriculum emphasized both intellectual education and industrial training, which reflected Washington's belief that African Americans could not afford to wait for social equality to come through political means alone. Instead, they needed to prove their worth through hard work, discipline, and economic productivity. Washington's approach was not without its critics. While he focused on building economic independence through vocational training, others, particularly W.E.B. Du Bois, argued that this model was too limited and failed to push for broader political and civil rights. Du Bois and his supporters believed that African Americans should be striving for higher education and fighting for political change to achieve full equality. Du Bois's vision of higher education and political activism stood in stark contrast to Washington's focus on accommodation and gradual progress through economic self-reliance. However, Washington remained resolute in his belief that his approach was the best way forward for African Americans. His decision to focus on industrial education was not just a reflection of his own experiences growing up in poverty, but also an acknowledgement of the social and economic realities that many Black Americans faced. Washington recognized that in a society that remained deeply segregated and resistant to change, the path to equality would have to come through practical means. One of Washington's key milestones came in 1895 with his famous Atlanta Exposition Address, a speech that would cement his reputation as one of the foremost Black leaders of his time. Delivered before an audience of both Black and white Americans, Washington's speech called for Black Americans to focus on economic self-improvement rather than political agitation. He famously said, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." This speech, which became known as the Atlanta Compromise, outlined Washington's philosophy of gradual progress, arguing that African Americans should focus on building their own economic success through hard work and vocational training, while accepting segregation and disenfranchisement in the short term. Washington's emphasis on patience and self-sufficiency resonated with many white Americans, particularly those in the South, who were eager to maintain the status quo. His speech won him the support of a number of influential white philanthropists, including Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who donated large sums of money to support Tuskegee and other Black institutions. However, the Atlanta Compromise also drew sharp criticism from other Black leaders, particularly Du Bois. Du Bois argued that Washington's accommodationist approach did not go far enough in demanding full civil rights and political equality for African Americans. Du Bois believed that Washington's model of industrial education would keep African Americans in subordinate positions, and that a more radical, confrontational approach was needed to secure political rights and higher education. Despite the criticism, Washington's influence continued to grow, and his leadership of Tuskegee solidified his position as a major figure in African American life. He became a trusted advisor to Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, offering his counsel on issues related to race and education. Washington's ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the time, balancing his relationships with both white and Black Americans, helped him gain access to the corridors of power and establish himself as a key figure in the national conversation on race. In addition to his work at Tuskegee, Washington's efforts to promote African American entrepreneurship were another key milestone in his career. He saw economic self-sufficiency as the path to true empowerment, and believed that Black Americans needed to establish their own businesses and industries in order to achieve independence. To this end, he worked tirelessly to promote Black entrepreneurship, believing that economic independence would lay the groundwork for social and political progress. Washington's work in this area extended beyond education. He also founded a number of organizations aimed at promoting economic opportunities for African Americans. One of his most notable achievements was the establishment of the National Negro Business League in 1900, which sought to encourage Black entrepreneurship and create networks of Black business owners across the country. This organization provided a platform for African Americans to share resources, support one another, and work toward building a more economically independent community. Throughout his life, Washington faced a series of decisions that challenged his beliefs and tested his resolve. Each decision, Whether it was the founding of Tuskegee, his speech at the Atlanta Exposition, or his efforts to promote black entrepreneurship, reflected his deep commitment to improving the lives of African Americans through practical means. His vision of progress was grounded in the belief that through education, hard work, and economic self-reliance, African Americans could overcome the obstacles placed before them and achieve dignity and respect in American society. While Booker T. Washington's rise to prominence as a leader and educator was filled with moments of success, it was not without its share of conflicts and challenges. These struggles came not only from external forces, such as the deeply entrenched racism and segregation of post-Reconstruction America, but also from within the African American community itself. Washington's philosophy, particularly his emphasis on vocational and industrial education, was often criticized by those who believed that it was insufficient in addressing the broader political and social inequalities faced by African Americans. One of the primary sources of conflict in Washington's life came from his relationship with other prominent African American leaders, especially W.E.B. Du Bois. While Washington championed the idea of gradual progress through education and economic self-sufficiency, Du Bois, along with others in the more intellectual and activist circles, believed that this approach was too conservative and failed to demand the full civil rights and political equality that African Americans deserved. Du Bois's vision called for higher education, political engagement, and direct confrontation with the discriminatory practices of segregation. The most significant public disagreement between Washington and Du Bois centered on the Atlanta Exposition Address in 1895, which became known as the Atlanta Compromise. In his speech, Washington argued that African Americans should focus on economic self-improvement and vocational training rather than push for political and civil rights. He famously stated, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." Washington believed that this approach would allow black Americans to prove their worth, through hard work, gain the respect of white Americans, and eventually secure equality. However, Du Bois and others in the civil rights movement rejected this idea, seeing it as a capitulation to the existing racial order. Du Bois' perspective was that Washington's philosophy condemned black Americans to a life of subservience and limited opportunity. Du Bois argued that the talented 10th, a small but highly educated and politically active elite, should lead the fight for full civil rights and higher education. Du Bois believed that only through challenging the status quo directly could African Americans ever hope to achieve true equality. This philosophical divide created tension within the African American community, and the debate between Washington and Du Bois would continue for many years. While Washington remained steadfast in his belief that vocational education was the best means of progress for the majority of African Americans, Du Bois' advocacy for political rights and higher education would become the foundation of the later civil rights movements of the 20th century. Despite the tensions between the two men, Washington's vision continued to shape the course of African American education for decades, especially in the South. In addition to the philosophical differences within the African American community, Washington also faced external challenges from the white power structures that controlled much of the Southern economy and political life. Washington's call for African Americans to focus on economic self-reliance through industrial education was viewed as a more acceptable approach by many white Southerners. However, it did not go without its critics. Washington's more moderate stance was often seen as a concession to the social and political status quo, and his efforts to maintain relationships with white elites were sometimes viewed with suspicion by more radical African American leaders. Washington's reputation as someone willing to work within the constraints of segregation led some to accuse him of accommodationism, or accepting second-class citizenship for black Americans in exchange for economic and educational opportunities. Despite these challenges, Washington continued to build Tuskegee Institute into a thriving educational institution. The school's success was, in many ways, a reflection of Washington's ability to navigate the complex racial landscape of the time. He was adept at securing funding from white philanthropists and political leaders, including industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. These donations helped Tuskegee grow and provided Washington with the resources he needed to expand the scope of his educational philosophy. However, his reliance on white financial support also led to criticism from those who believed that Washington's connections with wealthy whites compromised his ability to push for more aggressive civil rights reforms. Despite the tensions and conflicts, Washington remained committed to his philosophy of self-reliance, hard work, and gradual progress. He believed that the road to equality for African Americans was a long and difficult one, and he was willing to work within the system to bring about change. His efforts to build Tuskegee and promote African American economic independence were central to his legacy, even if they were not universally accepted by his peers. Another significant challenge for Washington was the constant pressure to defend his position as the preeminent African American leader. As the face of black education and leadership, Washington was often called upon to speak on behalf of African Americans in political and social matters. His relationships with politicians, both black and white, were crucial to his success. However, this also meant that he was regularly under scrutiny, and his every decision was subject to criticism. Washington's role as a spokesperson for African Americans was often fraught with tension, as he had to balance the demands of his community with the expectations of the white establishment. The tensions between Washington and Du Bois, as well as the broader conflict over the direction of African American leadership, came to a head at the turn of the century. As the political landscape of the United States began to shift, the question of how best to address the pressing issues of racial inequality became more urgent. Washington's leadership, which had been built on the principles of gradual progress and economic self-reliance, was increasingly seen as inadequate in the face of rising calls for political activism and civil rights. The more radical approaches to civil rights, represented by figures like Du Bois and the NAACP, would eventually gain prominence in the early 20th century. Washington's conflicts and challenges, both internal and external, were part of the larger struggle for African American identity and rights in the post-Reconstruction era. His legacy, while deeply influential in shaping African American education, was also shaped by the complex and often contentious debates within the black community about the best path forward. Washington's emphasis on vocational education, his relationships with white philanthropists, and his cautious approach to civil rights were central to his work, but also led to disagreements and controversies that would resonate long after his death. Despite these conflicts, Booker T. Washington remained steadfast in his belief that the path to progress for African Americans lay in education, hard work, and patience. His ability to navigate the shifting political and social landscape of his time is a testament to his leadership and his unwavering commitment to his vision of self-improvement through education. The year 1895 marked one of the most defining moments of Booker T. Washington's career and legacy, his famous speech at the Atlanta Exposition. This speech, which would come to be known as the Atlanta Compromise, solidified Washington's place as a prominent leader and spokesperson for African Americans in the late 19th century. Delivered before a large audience of both black and white Americans, Washington's words called for a cautious, pragmatic approach to race relations in the South, one that would focus on economic progress and vocational training for African Americans, rather than immediate political or civil rights. The context of the Atlanta Exposition was crucial in understanding the significance of Washington's address. The 1890s were a time of intense racial tension in the United States, particularly in the South. The Reconstruction era had ended nearly 20 years earlier, and while African Americans had gained some legal rights, they were still subject to widespread discrimination, segregation, and disenfranchisement. The period known as Jim Crow was beginning to take hold, solidifying racial segregation and creating an environment in which black Americans faced significant obstacles to equality. The exposition itself was a showcase of Southern industrial achievements and an attempt to demonstrate the South's economic recovery following the Civil War. Washington's speech was delivered as part of the event's opening ceremonies, and it became a key moment in the history of African American thought. The speech's themes reflected Washington's belief that African Americans could improve their social and economic standing by focusing on vocational education and self-reliance, rather than challenging the prevailing racial order. In the Atlanta Compromise, Washington famously articulated his vision for how Black Americans should navigate the realities of segregation and discrimination. His central argument was that African Americans should focus on economic success and personal development rather than demanding immediate political or civil rights. He expressed the idea that in matters of social equality, African Americans could remain separate as the fingers while still working together for mutual progress. Washington argued that, by demonstrating industriousness, respectability, and a strong work ethic, Black Americans could gradually earn the respect of white Americans and eventually secure full civil rights. Washington's approach was rooted in practicality. He recognized the harsh realities faced by African Americans, particularly in the South, and believed that fighting for political rights in the short term would be futile in the face of widespread racism and resistance. Instead, he believed that economic empowerment through education and vocational training would provide the foundation for African Americans to rise above their circumstances. Washington argued that this gradual approach would not only improve the lives of African Americans, but would also promote harmony between the races by focusing on shared economic goals. One of the key passages in Washington's speech that would come to define his philosophy was his statement, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." This statement emphasized Washington's belief that social integration, at least in the short term, was not essential for African Americans to succeed. Instead, he argued that African Americans should focus on their own advancement and contribute to the economic development of the South. Washington's belief in the importance of industrial education was at the heart of this argument, as he saw it as the most direct path to economic success for Black Americans. The speech was widely received with approval by many white Southerners and Northern philanthropists, who saw it as a reasonable and conciliatory approach to race relations. Washington's call for economic self-reliance was aligned with the prevailing attitudes of many white leaders who sought to maintain the racial status quo. In the years following the speech, Washington would receive significant financial support from white philanthropists, including industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who believed that Washington's emphasis on vocational training and economic development was a practical and non-threatening approach to improving the status of African Americans. However, the speech was not without its critics. Many African American leaders, particularly those in the more radical wing of the civil rights movement, found Washington's approach too accommodating and insufficiently confrontational. W.E.B. Du Bois, the most vocal critic of Washington's philosophy, saw the Atlanta Compromise as a betrayal of the struggle for full civil rights. Du Bois believed that Washington's emphasis on vocational education and his acceptance of segregation would ultimately keep African Americans in subordinate positions, perpetuating the social and economic disparities that had been established under slavery. Du Bois, along with other critics, argued that Washington's philosophy failed to address the pressing need for political and civil rights for African Americans. They believed that true equality could only be achieved through active political participation, including the right to vote, as well as higher education that would enable African Americans to take on leadership roles in society. Du Bois's more radical vision, which called for immediate political action and the pursuit of higher education, was in stark contrast to Washington's approach of gradualism and accommodation. Despite the criticism, Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech cemented his status as a leader in the African American community. His focus on vocational education and economic progress resonated with many Black Americans, especially those in the South, who were grappling with the realities of segregation and economic hardship. Washington's message of self-reliance and discipline was seen as a practical response to the challenges of the time, and his efforts to build educational institutions like Tuskegee Institute became a key part of his legacy. In the years following the speech, Washington continued to promote his vision of economic self-improvement through education. His approach became the foundation of his leadership in the African American community, and he worked tirelessly to expand Tuskegee and other schools that promoted vocational training. He believed that African Americans could best improve their social and economic status by focusing on practical skills and contributing to the development of their communities. The Atlanta Compromise speech remains one of the most important moments in the history of African American thought. Washington's vision of gradual progress, rooted in economic self-reliance and vocational education, became a dominant force in African American leadership for many years. While his philosophy was challenged by figures like Du Bois and others in the civil rights movement, Washington's legacy as a leader who prioritized education and economic empowerment has had a lasting impact on African American history. Booker T. Washington's leadership extended far beyond the walls of Tuskegee Institute. As the most prominent African American leader of his time, his influence shaped not only the education system, but also the broader social and political landscape of Black America. Washington's leadership style was pragmatic, focused on fostering cooperation between Black and white Americans, while emphasizing the value of economic self-sufficiency, vocational education, and social stability. His steady leadership helped guide the African American community through some of the most challenging years of racial discrimination and economic hardship. Washington's leadership within the African American community was grounded in his belief that economic independence and educational attainment were the most effective means by which Black Americans could improve their lives. He understood that, in the deeply segregated South, achieving political equality would be a slow and arduous process. For Washington, the best way forward was through practical vocational training that would empower African Americans to become self-sufficient, productive members of society. This vision resonated with many Black Americans, particularly in the South, who faced limited opportunities for education and employment. At the heart of Washington's leadership was his belief in the importance of education. He understood that for African Americans to thrive, they needed to acquire practical skills that would enable them to earn a living and contribute to the economic development of their communities. In his view, an educated Black workforce would not only elevate the economic status of African Americans, but also earn them the respect of white Americans. Washington saw vocational education as a means of demonstrating the worth of Black Americans and dispelling the pervasive stereotypes of laziness and incompetence that many white Southerners held. Under Washington's leadership, Tuskegee Institute became a model for this vision of practical education. The school's curriculum focused not just on traditional academic subjects, but also on agriculture, mechanics, and other trades that were deemed essential for economic progress. Washington encouraged his students to take pride in their work, whether it was in the classroom or in the fields, and he believed that the dignity of labor was a central part of the Black experience in America. Tuskegee was not only a place of learning, but also a community where students were taught to value hard work, discipline, and self-reliance. Washington's approach to leadership extended beyond Tuskegee and into the broader African American community. He believed that leadership required both vision and practicality, and he was committed to making tangible improvements in the lives of Black Americans. To this end, he worked to create partnerships with white philanthropists and political leaders who could provide financial support and help advance his educational initiatives. Washington's ability to secure funding for Tuskegee and other Black institutions was one of his most significant achievements, and it allowed him to expand his educational vision far beyond what most Black leaders of his time could achieve. Despite his success in garnering support from white donors, Washington's philosophy of accommodation was often seen as controversial. Some African American leaders, particularly those in the more radical wings of the civil rights movement, criticized Washington for his perceived willingness to compromise on issues of political equality. figures like W.E.B., Du Bois believed that Washington's focus on vocational training and economic self-reliance diverted attention from the need for political activism and civil rights. Du Bois, in particular, argued that Washington's moderate approach would keep African Americans in subjugation, unable to achieve true equality in American society. Yet Washington's approach had its supporters, particularly among the African American working class. His focus on economic self-sufficiency and practical education offered a tangible path forward for those who had little hope of obtaining higher education or political power in a segregated society. Washington's message was simple. Through hard work, perseverance, and discipline, African Americans could uplift themselves and their communities, regardless of the political climate. One of Washington's most notable contributions to the African American community was his role in the development of the National Negro Business League, NNBL, in 1900. The NNBL was an organization designed to promote and support African American businesses, encouraging economic cooperation and mutual support within the black community. Washington's belief in economic independence extended beyond education and into the realm of entrepreneurship, and the NNBL provided a platform for African American business owners to share resources, collaborate, and advance their interests. The League became an important part of Washington's broader vision of a self-sufficient black community that could thrive without relying on outside assistance. Washington's leadership was not without its critics, especially as the civil rights movement gained momentum in the early 20th century. His approach to race relations was often seen as too conciliatory, and his willingness to work with white leaders was viewed with suspicion by some African Americans who believed that a more direct confrontation with racism was necessary. Washington, however, was resolute in his belief that African Americans should focus on self-improvement and economic progress rather than political agitation. He argued that once black Americans had established themselves economically, they would be in a better position to demand political and civil rights. Despite the criticisms, Washington's leadership remained influential for much of his life. His ability to maintain a degree of cooperation between black and white Americans, while also promoting African American education and entrepreneurship, helped him become one of the most respected figures of his time. Washington's leadership was characterized by a combination of humility, pragmatism, and vision, and his ability to navigate the complexities of race relations in the South allowed him to make lasting contributions to the African American community. Washington's leadership extended beyond his role as an educator and spokesperson for African Americans. He also became a key figure in national politics, advising Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft on matters related to race and education. Washington's relationship with these presidents allowed him to influence national policy and advocate for African American interests at the highest levels of government. His political acumen and ability to maintain relationships with powerful figures helped cement his status as one of the foremost African American leaders of his time. In the end, Booker T. Washington's leadership was defined by his commitment to education, economic self-sufficiency, and gradual progress. His influence shaped the course of African American history in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and his legacy continues to inspire those who believe in the power of education and hard work as tools for social change. The establishment of Tuskegee Institute in 1881 was not just a professional achievement for Booker T. Washington. It was the realization of his long-held belief that education, particularly vocational and industrial education, was the key to the empowerment of African Americans. From its modest beginnings, Tuskegee would grow to become one of the most respected institutions for black education in the country, shaping generations of students and providing a model for education that combined academic learning with practical skills. At the time of its founding, Tuskegee was a small, struggling institution with little money and few resources. Washington, having recently assumed the role of the school's principal, faced an uphill battle in securing the support and resources necessary to establish Tuskegee as a viable institution. The school was originally housed in a modest building with just a handful of students. and its initial funding came from a combination of local black families, white philanthropists, and Washington's own tireless fundraising efforts. Washington's vision for Tuskegee was clear from the outset. He wanted to create a school that would not only provide black students with academic education, but also prepare them for the workforce. Tuskegee's curriculum would focus on practical skills such as agriculture, carpentry, mechanics, and other trades, skills that Washington believed were essential for African Americans to build economic independence and gain the respect of white Americans. In this way, Tuskegee was a reflection of Washington's belief that economic progress and self-sufficiency were the foundation for achieving social equality. The growth of Tuskegee was not without its challenges. The school's initial years were fraught with financial instability, and Washington had to constantly find ways to secure funding for the school. One of his most significant achievements was his ability to forge relationships with white philanthropists who shared his vision of black empowerment through education. Among the most notable of these supporters were industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and others who contributed significant amounts of money to the school. Washington's ability to convince these wealthy individuals to support Tuskegee was a testament to his political savvy and his ability to navigate the complex racial dynamics of the time. In addition to securing financial support, Washington faced the challenge of creating an effective educational model. He was determined to provide his students with a curriculum that combined academic learning with practical training, so they could leave Tuskegee prepared to make a living and contribute to their communities. Washington believed that vocational training was crucial for black Americans in the post-Reconstruction South, where economic opportunities for African Americans were limited and racial discrimination was pervasive. Tuskegee's emphasis on agriculture, trades, and industrial skills was a direct response to the lack of opportunities for African Americans to gain access to higher education or political power. Under Washington's leadership, Tuskegee grew rapidly. By the 1890s, the school had expanded its facilities and its student body, and its reputation as a model of industrial education began to spread. Washington's tireless work and dedication to Tuskegee's growth resulted in the creation of new programs and departments that focused on a range of practical subjects. The school became a hub for African American education, attracting students from all over the South and beyond. Washington's commitment to Tuskegee's success was unwavering, and his leadership shaped the school's identity for years to come. He believed in the importance of building a sense of community at Tuskegee, where students not only learned practical skills but also developed character and discipline. He emphasized the value of hard work, responsibility, and self-reliance, and he encouraged his students to take pride in the work they did. Whether it was in the classroom or on the farm, the physical growth of Tuskegee mirrored its increasing influence in the African American community. By the turn of the century, the school had expanded its campus and established new departments, including a program for teacher training. Tuskegee's emphasis on practical education made it one of the most respected institutions in the country, and Washington's model was widely admired. At the same time, Tuskegee became a center for the development of black leadership. Washington recognized that in order for African Americans to achieve social equality, they needed to have educated leaders who could guide their communities and advocate for their rights. As a result, Tuskegee became not only a place of learning but also a breeding ground for the next generation of black leaders. Despite the school's success, Washington's vision was not universally accepted. His focus on vocational education and economic self-sufficiency was criticized by some within the African American community, especially those who believed that political activism and higher education were essential to achieving full equality. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of Washington's most vocal critics, argued that Washington's model of education would keep African Americans in subordinate positions by focusing too much on economic issues and not enough on political and civil rights. Du Bois, along with other activists, believed that African Americans should demand their rights and challenge the discriminatory laws and practices that kept them oppressed. Washington, however, remained steadfast in his belief that economic independence was the most effective path to achieving social equality. He argued that African Americans could gain the respect of white Americans and demonstrate their worth by excelling in trades and contributing to the economy. Washington's vision was a slow and gradual process, but he believed it was the best approach for a community that had been disenfranchised for so long. The success of Tuskegee Institute under Washington's leadership was a testament to his commitment and vision. The school became one of the most influential institutions for African Americans in the South, and a symbol of Washington's belief in the transformative power of education. Through his efforts at Tuskegee, Washington demonstrated that education, grounded in practical skills, could provide African Americans with the tools they needed to rise above poverty and discrimination. His work at Tuskegee, along with his broader efforts to promote African American education and economic self-sufficiency, left a lasting legacy that would continue to shape the course of African American history. At the core of Booker T. Washington's educational philosophy was his belief in industrial education, the idea that African Americans could best achieve economic self-sufficiency, social respect, and eventual equality through vocational and trade-based learning. This philosophy was shaped by Washington's own experiences growing up in slavery, his early education, and his time at Hampton Institute. Through his time at Tuskegee Institute, Washington developed a clear and practical vision for what education for Black Americans should look like. Not just academic learning, but also the development of practical skills that could enable individuals to thrive in a racially segregated and economically challenging society. Washington's philosophy of industrial education was grounded in the reality that many African Americans in the South had limited access to higher education, and that economic opportunities were scarce, especially for Black people in a racially discriminatory society. He believed that by providing African Americans with the skills to enter the workforce and support themselves, they could achieve independence and improve their standing within their communities. For Washington, the ability to earn a living through hard work and discipline was the pathway to dignity and respect, both within the Black community and in the eyes of white Americans. At Tuskegee Institute, Washington implemented his philosophy by focusing on teaching practical, marketable skills to his students. The curriculum was designed to provide students with hands-on experience in a variety of trades, including agriculture, carpentry, bricklaying, tailoring, and other manual labor fields. Washington understood that industrial education was not just about acquiring specific skills, but also about instilling a sense of self-discipline, responsibility, and pride in one's work. He viewed this as a means of demonstrating the value of African Americans to society, showing that Black people could be industrious, productive, and capable of contributing to the economic growth of the country. Washington was deeply influenced by the example set by Hampton Institute, where he had been a student. Hampton's founder, General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, emphasized the importance of industrial education as a means of preparing African Americans for the realities of life in a racially segregated society. Armstrong believed that by learning practical trades, Black Americans could avoid the worst of the economic exploitation and discrimination that was prevalent in the South after the Civil War. Washington took these lessons to heart and, upon founding Tuskegee, focused his efforts on developing a school that would teach students the value of both academic learning and manual labor. Washington's approach was, in many ways, a response to the limitations he saw in the broader educational landscape for African Americans. Higher education, especially in the liberal arts, was still largely inaccessible to Black students in the South, and Washington felt that many Black Americans were being left behind in the push for more academic opportunities. He believed that it was more important to teach African Americans how to survive and thrive in the world as it was, rather than focusing on ideals of equality and political rights that seemed distant and unattainable in the immediate aftermath of slavery. His philosophy, however, was not without its critics. Some African American leaders, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, argued that Washington's emphasis on industrial education was too limited. Du Bois believed that in order for African Americans to truly achieve equality, they needed access to higher education and political engagement. Du Bois felt that Washington's focus on vocational training kept Black Americans in subordinate roles, reinforcing racial stereotypes that placed them in menial labor positions. Du Bois' philosophy, which would later become the foundation of the NAACP's advocacy for civil rights, called for immediate political action, the right to vote, and the creation of an educated black elite that could lead the fight for equality. Despite this criticism, Washington remained steadfast in his belief that industrial education was the most practical way forward for African Americans in the post-Reconstruction South. He argued that Black Americans needed to build their economic power first, and that only through economic success could they gain the respect and independence necessary to eventually fight for full civil rights. Washington believed that education should be accessible to all African Americans, not just the elite, and that vocational training was the most effective way to lift the majority out of poverty and into the workforce. Washington's emphasis on industrial education was grounded in a deep belief in the value of work. He saw labor as a dignifying force, one that could empower individuals and strengthen communities. His own experiences as a child of slavery, working in the fields alongside his mother, gave him a deep appreciation for the connection between labor and self-worth. At Tuskegee, Washington instilled this sense of pride in work in his students, teaching them that no job was beneath them if it helped support themselves and their families. Through this philosophy, he sought to counter the prevailing view that Black Americans were only suited for low-wage manual labor and were incapable of contributing to society in meaningful, dignified ways. In addition to the technical skills students learned at Tuskegee, Washington's philosophy also emphasized character development. He believed that education was not just about acquiring knowledge or mastering a trade. It was about building a strong moral foundation, one that would allow African Americans to stand tall in the face of adversity. Washington's teaching stressed the importance of personal responsibility, discipline, and integrity. He believed that by cultivating these qualities in his students, he could help them become not just skilled workers, but also exemplary citizens. Washington's belief in industrial education as a means of upliftment had a profound impact on African American education in the South. Tuskegee became a model for other institutions that followed Washington's lead, and his philosophy of combining academic learning with vocational training helped thousands of students gain the skills necessary to support themselves and their communities. While some critics continued to challenge Washington's approach, his success in building Tuskegee into a thriving educational institution demonstrated the power of his vision. Ultimately, Washington's philosophy of industrial education was a response to the realities of a segregated and racially oppressive society. He recognized that in the short term, African Americans could not afford to wait for political equality or social integration. They had to build their own foundation through economic self-reliance and education. Washington's lasting legacy lies in the success of Tuskegee Institute and the millions of African Americans whose lives were transformed by his educational philosophy. While Booker T. Washington's leadership and educational philosophy earned him widespread respect, particularly from white philanthropists and political leaders. He also faced significant criticism from other influential African American leaders. The most notable critic of Washington's approach was W.E.B. Du Bois, a scholar, activist, and one of the leading voices of the emerging civil rights movement. Du Bois and Washington represented two distinct philosophies on how best to address the challenges facing African Americans in the post-Reconstruction era, and their differing visions sparked an ongoing debate that would shape the future of African American leadership. Washington's philosophy of industrial education and gradual progress through economic self-reliance was in stark contrast to Du Bois' call for immediate political and civil rights for African Americans. Du Bois was a proponent of higher education, believing that an educated black elite, or the talented 10th, should lead the charge for full civil rights and political participation. He believed that African Americans should demand their rights rather than wait for gradual change, and he emphasized the importance of higher education in producing leaders who could advocate for these rights. Du Bois' approach was rooted in the belief that African Americans should challenge the racial status quo directly, while Washington's philosophy was more accommodating and focused on working within the existing system. The key point of contention between Washington and Du Bois was the role of education in the African American struggle for equality. Washington believed that vocational and industrial education was the most practical way for African Americans to achieve economic independence and, over time, gain the respect of white Americans. He argued that political rights and social integration could not be immediately achieved, and that the best course of action was to focus on economic self-sufficiency through hard work and education in practical trades. Washington's emphasis on vocational training was based on his belief that economic success would be the key to earning the respect and dignity that African Americans needed to rise above their circumstances. Du Bois, on the other hand, felt that Washington's approach was insufficient and that it relegated African Americans to a permanent state of subordination. Du Bois believed that Washington's focus on vocational training limited African Americans' potential and kept them in a subordinate position within society. Du Bois argued that political activism, higher education, and the fight for civil rights should be the primary focus for African Americans, rather than accepting segregation and disenfranchisement in the short term. Du Bois famously criticized Washington's philosophy in his book The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, where he discussed his vision of the talented tenth and the need for black intellectuals and political leaders to challenge the prevailing system of racial inequality. The disagreement between Washington and Du Bois was not just ideological, it was also personal. Washington, a pragmatist by nature, believed that the best way to improve the condition of African Americans was to work within the existing system, forging relationships with white philanthropists, industrialists, and politicians. He was careful in his public statements, often avoiding direct confrontations with white Americans and focusing instead on practical issues like education, vocational training, and economic independence. Washington's ability to work with white leaders and secure funding for Tuskegee Institute was a testament to his diplomatic skills, but it also earned him the criticism of those who believed that his approach was too conciliatory. Du Bois, in contrast, was a vocal critic of Washington's approach, accusing him of compromising on issues of civil rights. Du Bois argued that by focusing on economic self-sufficiency and vocational training, Washington was reinforcing the racial hierarchy that had been established during slavery. Du Bois believed that African Americans should demand their rights and take an active role in challenging the discriminatory laws and practices that kept them oppressed. He saw Washington's willingness to accept segregation and disenfranchisement as a betrayal of the struggle for full civil rights. The tension between Washington and Du Bois was not limited to their disagreements on education. Du Bois also criticized Washington's public stance on segregation and the Atlanta Compromise. In his famous 1903 address, Du Bois described Washington as a figure who had surrendered to white America and had sold out African Americans by accepting segregation as a temporary condition. Du Bois believed that Washington's willingness to work with white elites and his emphasis on vocational education were part of a broader strategy of accommodation that would perpetuate the racial status quo rather than challenge it. For Du Bois, Washington's emphasis on gradual progress was insufficient in the face of the urgent need for full civil rights. Washington, for his part, responded to Du Bois's criticisms by emphasizing the importance of unity and the need for African Americans to work together to achieve their goals. While he acknowledged the validity of Du Bois' call for political action, Washington remained convinced that the focus should be on economic self-reliance. He believed that by proving their worth through education and hard work, African Americans could earn the respect of white Americans and eventually gain full civil rights. Washington often argued that it was not the time for radical change but for steady, patient progress. His response to Du Bois and other critics was that the majority of African Americans, particularly those in the South, were not in a position to engage in the political struggles that Du Bois advocated. Instead, he believed that they should focus on practical solutions that could improve their lives in the short term. Despite their differences, both Washington and Du Bois made lasting contributions to the African American struggle for equality. Washington's focus on education, hard work, and economic self-sufficiency created a foundation for the development of African American communities, particularly in the South, where opportunities were limited. Tuskegee Institute, under Washington's leadership, became a symbol of black educational achievement and a model for schools that emphasize vocational training. Washington's legacy lives on in the many African Americans who benefited from his vision of practical education. Du Bois, on the other hand, played a crucial role in advancing the fight for political and civil rights. As a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, Du Bois helped to push the civil rights agenda forward, advocating for the right to vote, the desegregation of schools, and full political participation for African Americans. His belief in the power of higher education and political activism would influence the development of the modern civil rights movement. Though Washington and Du Bois represented different philosophies, their contrasting views on the path to racial equality sparked important debates that would continue to shape the African American experience for years to come. Washington's advocacy for industrial education and gradual progress, alongside Du Bois's calls for immediate civil rights and higher education, highlighted the complexity of the struggle for African American equality in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Booker T. Washington's influence extended far beyond the African American community. As the leader of Tuskegee Institute and one of the most prominent black figures of his time, Washington became a key intermediary between black Americans and white Americans, particularly in the South. Washington's philosophy of economic self-sufficiency, vocational education, and gradual social progress was embraced by many white philanthropists, political leaders, and business people who were eager to see the South rebuild in the aftermath of the Civil War. His ability to secure substantial financial support for Tuskegee Institute from wealthy white donors and industrialists, including Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, speaks to his skill as a leader and his ability to navigate the complexities of race relations during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Washington's philosophy of accommodation, his belief that African Americans should focus on vocational training and economic self-improvement, rather than pushing for immediate political and civil rights, was seen by many white Southerners as a more acceptable alternative to the more radical calls for equality that were being made by other African American leaders. Washington's willingness to work within the confines of segregation and his emphasis on the importance of black economic contributions to the South made him a more palatable figure for many white Americans, especially those who sought to maintain the social and political status quo. While many white Americans admired Washington's pragmatic approach, his relationships with white leaders were not without their complexities. Washington's careful diplomacy and his willingness to work within the system earned him both respect and suspicion. For some, his emphasis on economic self-sufficiency was seen as a way to appease white Southerners who feared black advancement, while for others, it was a strategy to achieve long-term change in the face of entrenched racism and disenfranchisement. One of the most significant moments in Washington's relationship with white America came in 1901, when he was invited to dinner at the White House by President Theodore Roosevelt. This invitation was a groundbreaking moment in American history, as it marked the first time that a black leader had been invited to dine with the sitting president in the White House. The dinner was highly symbolic, signaling a shift in the way that some white Americans viewed black leadership and the potential for reconciliation in the post-Reconstruction era. The dinner was controversial at the time, especially in the South. Many white Southerners saw Washington's invitation as an affront to the social order and a challenge to the racial hierarchy that had been in place for generations. Washington himself was keenly aware of the political implications of the dinner, and he used the opportunity to advocate for the importance of education and economic progress for Black Americans. He maintained that if African Americans could demonstrate their worth through hard work and self-reliance, they would earn the respect of white Americans and eventually gain the rights and opportunities they deserved. For Roosevelt, the invitation was an acknowledgement of Washington's growing influence and the importance of his work in promoting black education and self-sufficiency. The president viewed Washington as a figure who could help bridge the divide between black and white Americans and promote a vision of cooperation and mutual progress. However, the dinner also stirred tensions within the White House, particularly among Roosevelt's Southern supporters, who were upset by the president's decision to honor Washington. Roosevelt, who had long been a proponent of civil rights, defended his decision, arguing that Washington's work at Tuskegee was helping to improve the lives of African Americans and contribute to the rebuilding of the South. Despite the controversy, the invitation marked a significant moment in the history of race relations in the United States. It demonstrated that Washington's influence had reached the highest levels of government and that his philosophy of gradual progress through education and economic self-sufficiency was beginning to gain acceptance among some white Americans. However, it also underscored the limitations of Washington's approach. While his efforts were admired by many, they were also seen as a concession to the racial status quo. Washington's refusal to challenge segregation or demand full civil rights left him vulnerable to criticism from more radical black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that Washington's diplomacy and accommodationism were holding back the progress of African Americans. Washington's relationship with white America was not limited to his interactions with political leaders. He also formed relationships with white philanthropists and business leaders who were instrumental in funding Tuskegee Institute and other educational initiatives for African Americans. Washington's ability to secure financial support from wealthy whites was one of his greatest achievements, and it allowed him to expand Tuskegee's curriculum, build new facilities, and provide scholarships for students who could not afford to attend. Washington's success in this area was a testament to his diplomatic skills and his ability to navigate the complex racial dynamics of the time. At the same time, Washington's dependence on white financial support led to criticism from those within the African American community, who felt that he was compromising too much in order to secure resources. Critics argued that Washington's relationships with white donors were a form of submission, and that his willingness to work within the constraints of segregation was a betrayal of the black struggle for full equality. Washington's critics, like Du Bois, believed that African Americans should demand their rights and engage in political activism rather than relying on the charity of wealthy whites to improve their situation. Despite the criticism, Washington remained committed to his philosophy of economic self-sufficiency and vocational education. He believed that through hard work and discipline, African Americans could earn their place in society and eventually gain the respect and rights they deserved. Washington's vision of black progress was based on the idea that African Americans should prove their worth through tangible achievements, rather than relying on political or legal battles. His relationships with white Americans, including politicians, philanthropists, and business leaders, were essential to his ability to achieve his goals, but they were also a source of tension and controversy within the black community. Ultimately, Washington's legacy in his relationship with white America is one of pragmatism, diplomacy, and the pursuit of self-improvement through education and economic independence. While his philosophy was not universally accepted and his accommodationist approach drew criticism from other black leaders, Washington's ability to build bridges between black and white Americans helped lay the foundation for the civil rights struggles that would follow in the 20th century. His legacy continues to be a subject of debate, as his approach to race relations shaped not only his own life, but the lives of countless African Americans who benefited from his educational vision. By the late 19th century, Booker T. Washington had firmly established himself as the leading African American figure in the United States, and his influence extended far beyond the walls of Tuskegee Institute. As Washington's leadership at Tuskegee grew, so too did his ability to shape and control a network of African American institutions, organizations, and leaders. This network, which would later come to be known as the Tuskegee Machine, was a testament to Washington's political acumen, strategic thinking, and ability to leverage his influence to promote his vision of African American progress. The Tuskegee Machine was not a formal political organization, but rather a loose network of institutions, business leaders, educators, and activists who shared Washington's belief in the power of vocational education and economic self-reliance as the key to African American advancement. At its core, the Tuskegee Machine was driven by Washington's efforts to create a national system of African American education that prioritized vocational training, practical skills, and self-sufficiency. This network allowed Washington to extend his influence to a wide range of African American communities across the South and beyond, ensuring that his educational philosophy would become the dominant model for black institutions throughout the country. Washington's ability to create this network was largely due to his masterful use of patronage and diplomacy. As he expanded Tuskegee Institute, Washington sought to cultivate relationships with a wide range of influential figures, both black and white. These relationships included philanthropists, business leaders, politicians, and even other black leaders who shared Washington's vision of economic progress through education. In particular, Washington's connections with white philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and others were crucial in securing the funding and resources needed to grow Tuskegee and other black educational institutions. These donors provided Washington with the financial backing that allowed him to expand Tuskegee's curriculum and facilities, ensuring that the school could continue to serve as a model for African American education. Through these philanthropic relationships, Washington was able to establish a system of black education that was largely shaped by his own vision of vocational training. His ability to attract and maintain the support of white donors, many of whom were highly influential in American business and politics, allowed him to steer the direction of African American education in a way that was often at odds with the demands for political rights and higher education made by leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington's focus on economic self-reliance and gradual progress was seen as more palatable to white philanthropists and politicians who were hesitant to challenge the racial status quo, making it easier for Washington to gain the support he needed. To expand his influence, at Tuskegee, Washington created a model for African American education that emphasized practical, hands-on experience in a variety of trades and industries. His goal was to equip students with the skills they needed to enter the workforce and become economically self-sufficient. In Washington's view, this kind of education would not only improve the economic standing of African Americans, but also demonstrate their worth to white Americans, who often viewed black people as inferior. By providing black students with the skills to succeed in the workforce, Washington hoped to earn the respect of white Americans and over time open the door to greater political and civil rights. Washington's leadership at Tuskegee also allowed him to wield significant political influence within the African American community. He was not only the head of one of the most important educational institutions in the country, but also a trusted advisor to African American politicians, businessmen, and community leaders. Through his work at Tuskegee and his network of connections, Washington became the central figure in African American education, using his influence to shape the policies and priorities of the black community. This network of influence, which became known as the Tuskegee Machine, allowed Washington to exert control over a wide range of African American institutions, ensuring that his vision of education and self-reliance would remain the dominant force. Within the black community, however, Washington's consolidation of power through the Tuskegee Machine was not without its critics. His critics, including W.E.B., Du Bois, and other members of the intellectual elite, saw Washington's control over African American education as an attempt to monopolize the discourse on race and progress. Du Bois, in particular, was deeply critical of Washington's emphasis on vocational training, arguing that it limited the potential of African Americans and kept them in subservient positions. Du Bois believed that higher education and political activism were essential for African Americans to achieve full civil rights, and that Washington's focus on vocational education was an accommodation to the racist status quo. Despite this criticism, Washington's ability to build and maintain the Tuskegee machine was a testament to his political skill and his understanding of the complexities of race relations in the post-Reconstruction South. Washington was a pragmatist who understood that the path to progress for African Americans would not be easy, and that it would require working within the constraints of segregation and racial prejudice. His vision for African American advancement was rooted in the belief that economic self-sufficiency was the key to gaining respect and ultimately achieving political rights. The Tuskegee machine also played a crucial role in Washington's efforts to influence national politics. By cultivating relationships with powerful figures in government, business, and education, Washington was able to shape public policy in ways that benefited African Americans. He was a trusted advisor to several U.S. presidents, including Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, and he used his position to advocate for the needs of Black Americans, particularly in the areas of education and economic opportunity. Washington's ability to navigate the political landscape and secure funding for his educational initiatives helped ensure that his vision of progress would continue to shape the future of African American education. While Washington's control over the Tuskegee machine allowed him to make significant strides in advancing African American education and economic independence, it also created tensions within the Black community. His emphasis on gradual progress and accommodation to white America was viewed by some as a betrayal of the struggle for civil rights. Washington's critics believed that his focus on vocational training and economic self-reliance distracted from the urgent need for political and civil rights. This debate between Washington's philosophy of gradualism and Du Bois's call for immediate political action would continue to shape the trajectory of African American leadership for decades. In the end, the Tuskegee machine represents Washington's profound influence on the direction of African American education and his ability to shape the discourse on race and progress in America. Despite the criticisms and controversies surrounding his approach, Washington's legacy as a leader who built a system of Black education and economic empowerment remains a testament to his vision, political skill, and dedication to uplifting the African American community. Booker T. Washington's influence as a leader of the African American community extended far beyond the confines of Tuskegee Institute and reached the highest levels of American government. His ability to navigate the complex political landscape of his time and build relationships with powerful white leaders, including Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, further solidified his position as one of the most influential Black figures in American history. Washington's relationship with the White House was a testament to his diplomatic skills and his ability to use his position to advocate for the interest of African Americans. Washington's most famous encounter with the White House came in 1901 when he was invited to dinner by President Theodore Roosevelt. This event marked a historic moment in American history, as Washington became the first African American to dine with a sitting president at the White House. The dinner was not only a symbolic gesture, but also a reflection of Washington's growing influence in national politics. Roosevelt's invitation to Washington was seen as an acknowledgement of his leadership and the importance of his work in promoting Black education and economic self-sufficiency. The dinner, however, was met with significant controversy, particularly in the South. Many white Southerners were outraged by the idea of an African American being invited to the White House, and the event sparked a fierce debate over race relations and social equality. Despite the backlash, Washington handled the situation with grace and diplomacy. He used the opportunity to advocate for the importance of education, self-reliance, and economic progress for African Americans, framing his message in a way that would resonate with both white and Black Americans. Washington's relationship with President Roosevelt was one of mutual respect. though it was not without its tensions. Roosevelt, who had long been a proponent of civil rights, recognized Washington's leadership and believed that his work at Tuskegee was making a significant contribution to the development of African American communities. Washington, for his part, saw Roosevelt as an ally who could help advance the cause of black education and economic progress. Their partnership was a reflection of Washington's belief that progress for African Americans could be achieved through cooperation and gradual change rather than through confrontation or demands for immediate civil rights. During his time as an advisor to Roosevelt, Washington was able to influence national policy on issues related to race and education. He worked closely with the president to promote vocational education for African Americans and advocated for greater economic opportunities for black workers in the South. Washington's ability to use his position to advocate for these causes was a testament to his political acumen and his understanding of the complexities of race relations in America. While Washington's relationship with Roosevelt was largely positive, it was not without its challenges. Washington's efforts to promote African American rights through economic and educational reform often clashed with the more radical civil rights agendas being advanced by other black leaders, such as W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, who was a vocal critic of Washington's philosophy, believed that Washington's focus on vocational education and gradual progress was insufficient in the fight for full civil rights. Du Bois called for immediate political action and the pursuit of higher education for African Americans, believing that only through direct confrontation with racial inequality could true equality be achieved. Washington, however, remained steadfast in his belief that African Americans could best achieve equality through economic success and the development of practical skills. He argued that political rights and social integration would come in time, but that African Americans first needed to prove their worth through hard work, education, and self-reliance. His ability to work with Roosevelt and other white leaders to secure financial support for Tuskegee and other black institutions was a reflection of his belief that economic empowerment would lay the foundation for greater political rights. Washington's relationship with Roosevelt was not just about advocating for African American education and economic progress. It was also about fostering mutual respect between black and white Americans. Washington believed that the path to equality lay in demonstrating that African Americans were capable of contributing to society in meaningful ways. His emphasis on vocational training and hard work was designed to show that African Americans could earn the respect of white Americans by proving their worth through tangible achievements. The invitation to dinner at the White House was a powerful symbol of Washington's growing influence, but it also reflected the limitations of his approach to race relations. While Washington's efforts to build relationships with white leaders were successful in advancing the cause of black education and economic self-sufficiency, they also highlighted the challenges of achieving true social and political equality for African Americans. Washington's willingness to work within the confines of segregation and his focus on gradual progress were seen by some as a compromise that allowed the racial status quo to persist. Despite these criticisms, Washington's relationship with the White House and his ability to influence national policy demonstrated the breadth of his leadership. His diplomatic approach to race relations and his emphasis on practical solutions to racial inequality allowed him to navigate the political landscape of his time and secure lasting support for African American education and economic advancement. Washington's ability to maintain relationships with powerful white leaders while advocating for the needs of black Americans was a testament to his leadership and his vision for the future of African American communities. In the years following the dinner at the White House, Washington continued to work with Presidents Roosevelt and Taft to promote African American education and economic self-sufficiency. His efforts to secure funding for Tuskegee and other black institutions helped to establish a lasting legacy of black educational achievement, and his influence in the White House remained a key part of his political strategy. Washington's relationship with the White House, while not without its controversies, ultimately helped to advance the cause of African American education and economic empowerment. laying the groundwork for the civil rights struggles that would follow in the 20th century. As Booker T. Washington's influence grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he began to place significant emphasis not only on education, but also on the rise of black entrepreneurship as a means of achieving economic independence. Washington recognized that the long-term success of African Americans would not only come from securing educational opportunities and vocational skills, but also from developing a robust black business sector that could provide economic empowerment for black families and communities. In Washington's view, economic independence was essential for African Americans to gain the respect and recognition of white Americans, and he understood that black entrepreneurs played a critical role in shaping the economic future of their communities. In the post-Reconstruction South, where many black Americans were still disenfranchised and limited by racial discrimination, the ability to build wealth through entrepreneurship was one of the few ways to achieve self-sufficiency. Washington's advocacy for entrepreneurship was a natural extension of his belief in the power of education to uplift African Americans. He saw vocational training as a stepping stone for many black people to enter skilled trades and crafts. But he also recognized that starting and running businesses would give African Americans the autonomy and economic leverage they needed to break free from the oppressive structures that had been established after the Civil War. Through his work at Tuskegee Institute, Washington helped to foster a culture of entrepreneurship among his students and the broader African American community. He encouraged students to start their own businesses, emphasizing the importance of initiative, discipline, and hard work. Tuskegee itself became a model for this approach to self-sufficiency. The school's farm, carpentry workshops, and mechanical shops provided both education and practical experience for students, preparing them to go into various trades upon graduation. Washington also sought to connect black business owners with one another, fostering a sense of community and cooperation that would help strengthen the economic position of African Americans. One of his most significant contributions in this regard was the establishment of the National Negro Business League, NNBL, in 1900. The League's primary goal was to encourage the development of black businesses by promoting collaboration, networking, and mutual support. Washington envisioned the NNBL as a platform where black entrepreneurs could share ideas, access resources, and advocate for policies that would create a more favorable economic environment for black-owned businesses. The NNBL quickly grew into a powerful organization with branches across the United States. Its impact was felt not just in the South, but also in the North, where African American businesses were beginning to thrive in urban centers. Washington's leadership of the NNBL was a key element in advancing his vision of a self-sufficient black economy, one that would eventually provide the foundation for greater social and political power. Washington's advocacy for black entrepreneurship was rooted in his belief that the economic success of black Americans would directly contribute to their social and political success. He saw entrepreneurship as a way for African Americans to gain respect and visibility in a society that often relegated them to subordinate positions. By building businesses and creating wealth, Washington believed that African Americans could prove their value to white Americans, who often saw them as inferior or incapable of contributing to the nation's economic development. At the time, Washington's emphasis on entrepreneurship was seen as a pragmatic solution to the challenges faced by African Americans. In an era when formal political rights were limited and racial segregation was entrenched, the ability to control one's economic future was a powerful tool for achieving some degree of autonomy. Black entrepreneurs, though still working within a system that largely excluded them from many opportunities, were able to build businesses that catered to their community's needs, and in doing so created jobs, built wealth, and contributed to the development of a more prosperous black middle class. Despite the significant challenges faced by African American entrepreneurs, such as limited access to capital, discriminatory banking practices, and legal barriers to business ownership, Washington remained optimistic about the potential for black businesses to thrive. His own work at Tuskegee demonstrated the possibility of success through persistence and hard work, and he encouraged his students and fellow African Americans to believe in their ability to succeed in the business world. He also understood that economic success could serve as a means of combating racial stereotypes that portrayed African Americans as lazy or incapable of contributing to society. Washington's advocacy for black entrepreneurship was closely tied to his broader philosophy of self-reliance. He believed that economic independence was the key to gaining respect and dignity in a society that often denied African Americans their rights. By focusing on building businesses, creating jobs, and developing economic power, Washington thought that black Americans could assert their worth and, over time, earn their place in the social and political fabric of the nation. His efforts to promote entrepreneurship also had a significant impact on the development of black business institutions. For example, many of the early black-owned businesses that flourished during Washington's era were in fields such as insurance, banking, retail, and real estate. These businesses were often owned and operated by educated African Americans who had received training in Washington's vocational schools or similar institutions. They formed the backbone of a nascent black business community that began to challenge the idea that African Americans could only work in menial, unskilled jobs. One notable example of a successful black entrepreneur during this period was Madam C.J. Walker, who built an empire in the hair care industry and became one of the wealthiest African American women in history. Walker, who had attended Tuskegee, was heavily influenced by Washington's emphasis on self-sufficiency and the power of entrepreneurship. Her success was part of a broader movement of African Americans who were breaking free from the economic limitations imposed by segregation and discrimination, and her story became an inspiration to many others who aspired to build their own businesses. While Washington's philosophy of entrepreneurship and economic self-reliance was highly influential, it was not without its critics. Some African American leaders, particularly those aligned with Du Bois, argued that Washington's focus on vocational education and business development was too narrow and failed to address the broader political and civil rights issues facing African Americans. These leaders called for a more radical approach to fighting for equality, one that would include the demand for political rights, higher education, and social integration. Despite the criticism, Washington's advocacy for entrepreneurship and his efforts to build a self-sustaining black economy were central to his legacy. He understood that, in a society where African Americans were systematically denied many of the basic rights and opportunities afforded to white citizens, economic empowerment was the best way to make lasting change. Washington's belief in the transformative power of black entrepreneurship continues to inspire generations of African Americans to pursue business ventures and create opportunities for themselves and their communities. As Booker T. Washington's influence grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He began to place significant emphasis not only on education, but also on the rise of black entrepreneurship as a means of achieving economic independence. Washington recognized that the long-term success of African Americans would not only come from securing educational opportunities and vocational skills, but also from developing a robust black business sector that could provide economic empowerment for black families and communities. In Washington's view, economic independence was essential for African Americans to gain the respect and recognition of white Americans, and he understood that black entrepreneurs played a critical role in shaping the economic future of their communities. In the post-Reconstruction South, where many black Americans were still disenfranchised and limited by racial discrimination, the ability to build wealth through entrepreneurship was one of the few ways to achieve self-sufficiency. Washington's advocacy for entrepreneurship was a natural extension of his belief in the power of education to uplift African Americans. He saw vocational training as a stepping stone for many black people to enter skilled trades and crafts, but he also recognized that starting and running businesses would give African Americans the autonomy and economic leverage they needed to break free from the oppressive structures that had been established after the Civil War. Through his work at Tuskegee Institute, Washington helped to foster a culture of entrepreneurship among his students and the broader African American community. He encouraged students to start their own businesses, emphasizing the importance of initiative, discipline, and hard work. Tuskegee itself became a model for this approach to self-sufficiency. The school's farm, carpentry workshops, and mechanical shops provided both education and practical experience for students, preparing them to go into various trades upon graduation. Washington also sought to connect black business owners with one another, fostering a sense of community and cooperation that would help strengthen the economic position of African Americans. One of his most significant contributions in this regard was the establishment of the National Negro Business League, NNBL, in 1900. The League's primary goal was to encourage the development of black businesses by promoting collaboration, networking, and mutual support. Washington envisioned the NNBL as a platform where black entrepreneurs could share ideas, access resources, and advocate for policies that would create a more favorable economic environment for black-owned businesses. The NNBL quickly grew into a powerful organization with branches across the United States. Its impact was felt not just in the South, but also in the North, where African American businesses were beginning to thrive in urban centers. Washington's leadership of the NNBL was a key element in advancing his vision of a self-sufficient black economy, one that would eventually provide the foundation for greater social and political power. Washington's advocacy for black entrepreneurship was rooted in his belief that the economic success of black Americans would directly contribute to their social and political success. He saw entrepreneurship as a way for African Americans to gain respect and visibility in a society that often relegated them to subordinate positions. By building businesses and creating wealth, Washington believed that African Americans could prove their value to white Americans, who often saw them as inferior or incapable of contributing to the nation's economic development. At the time, Washington's emphasis on entrepreneurship was seen as a pragmatic solution to the challenges faced by African Americans. In an era when formal political rights were limited and racial segregation was entrenched, the ability to control one's economic future was a powerful tool for achieving some degree of autonomy. Black entrepreneurs, though still working within a system that largely excluded them from many opportunities, were able to build businesses that catered to their community's needs, and in doing so created jobs, built wealth, and contributed to the development of a more prosperous black middle class. Despite the significant challenges faced by African American entrepreneurs, such as limited access to capital, discriminatory banking practices, and legal barriers to business ownership, Washington remained optimistic about the potential for black businesses to thrive. His own work at Tuskegee demonstrated the possibility of success through persistence and hard work, and he encouraged his students and fellow African Americans to believe in their ability to succeed in the business world. He also understood that economic success could serve as a means of combating racial stereotypes that portrayed African Americans as lazy or incapable of contributing to society. Washington's advocacy for black entrepreneurship was closely tied to his broader philosophy of self-reliance. He believed that economic independence was the key to gaining respect and dignity in a society that often denied African Americans their rights. By focusing on building businesses, creating jobs, and developing economic power, Washington thought that black Americans could assert their worth and, over time, earn their place in the social and political fabric of the nation. His efforts to promote entrepreneurship also had a significant impact on the development of black business institutions. For example, many of the early black-owned businesses that flourished during Washington's era were in fields such as insurance, banking, retail, and real estate. These businesses were often owned and operated by educated African Americans who had received training in Washington's vocational schools or similar institutions. They formed the backbone of a nascent black business community that began to challenge the idea that African Americans could only work in menial, unskilled jobs. One notable example of a successful black entrepreneur during this period was Madam C.J. Walker, who built an empire in the hair care industry and became one of the wealthiest African American women in history. Walker, who had attended Tuskegee, was heavily influenced by Washington's emphasis on self-sufficiency and the power of entrepreneurship. Her success was part of a broader movement of African Americans who were breaking free from the economic limitations imposed by segregation and discrimination, and her story became an inspiration to many others who aspired to build their own businesses. While Washington's philosophy of entrepreneurship and economic self-reliance was highly influential, it was not without its critics. Some African American leaders, particularly those aligned with Du Bois, argued that Washington's focus on vocational education and business development was too narrow and failed to address the broader political and civil rights issues facing African Americans. These leaders called for a more radical approach to fighting for equality, one that would include the demand for political rights, higher education, and social integration. Despite the criticism, Washington's advocacy for entrepreneurship and his efforts to build a self-sustaining black economy were central to his legacy. He understood that, in a society where African Americans were systematically denied many of the basic rights and opportunities afforded to white citizens, economic empowerment was the best way to make lasting change. Washington's belief in the transformative power of black entrepreneurship continues to inspire generations of African Americans to pursue business ventures and create opportunities for themselves and their communities. Despite Booker T. Washington's remarkable successes as an educator, leader, and public figure, his life was not without personal struggles, particularly in his later years. Washington's health began to decline in the early 1900s, and this gradual deterioration had a significant impact on both his personal life and his work at Tuskegee Institute. While his influence continued to grow throughout the country, the toll of constant work, physical strain, and the demands of leadership began to take a heavy toll on his body. In the years leading up to the turn of the century, Washington's workload was relentless. As the head of Tuskegee Institute, he was responsible for overseeing all aspects of the school, from its educational programs to its fundraising efforts. He was also a highly sought-after speaker, delivering lectures across the United States and abroad. In addition to his educational responsibilities, Washington served as an advisor to several U.S. presidents and played a key role in advocating for African American interests at the national level. His ability to maintain this level of activity was a testament to his personal drive and commitment to his vision of African American upliftment. However, the pressure of such an exhaustive schedule eventually began to wear on his health. In his early years as a leader, Washington had displayed remarkable resilience, but by the early 1900s, the physical strain of his responsibilities began to catch up with him. He suffered from a variety of ailments, including severe exhaustion, which led him to take periods of rest to try to recover his strength. Washington's constant travel, public engagements, and the stress of maintaining his many responsibilities had a cumulative effect on his body, and he began to experience increasing physical difficulties. Washington's health struggles were compounded by the fact that, as a public figure, he felt a constant pressure to present himself as strong and capable. His role as the leader of Tuskegee and a prominent spokesperson for African American rights demanded that he maintain a stoic and composed public persona. In private, however, he struggled with the toll his health was taking on him. Despite his declining physical condition, Washington continued to push himself, often working long hours and neglecting his own well-being in favor of fulfilling his many responsibilities. One of the most significant challenges Washington faced was his struggle with what was likely a combination of high blood pressure and heart-related issues. His health problems were not widely known to the public at the time, but in retrospect it is clear that Washington's later years were marked by physical pain and discomfort. His declining health began to affect his ability to manage Tuskegee as efficiently as he had in the past. While he remained deeply involved in the school's operations, he began to rely more heavily on his trusted colleagues and administrators to handle the day-to-day management of the institution. In addition to his physical struggles, Washington also faced personal and emotional challenges. In his later years, He experienced growing isolation as his health deteriorated, and the weight of his leadership responsibilities became more burdensome. Despite his widespread influence and the support of his colleagues, Washington often found himself grappling with feelings of exhaustion and a sense of personal sacrifice. He had dedicated much of his life to the cause of African American education and economic self-sufficiency, but at times the strain of this work left him feeling personally unfulfilled and worn down. Washington's health decline also coincided with a period of increasing criticism and internal conflict within the African American community. His leadership, which had been widely praised in the early years of his career, was now being challenged by figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that Washington's philosophy of gradual progress and vocational education was too limiting. Washington's refusal to embrace more radical political change, as advocated by Du Bois and others, led to tensions within the African American leadership. While Washington's philosophy of economic self-sufficiency had gained considerable support, particularly among white philanthropists, the growing demands for civil rights and higher education from younger African American leaders began to erode his influence among some of his peers. Despite these challenges, Washington remained committed to his vision until the end of his life. His health continued to decline, but he remained involved in the operations of Tuskegee and worked tirelessly to maintain the school's success. He continued to travel and speak, though increasingly his appearances were limited by his physical condition. Washington's declining health ultimately became a matter of public concern, and he faced growing pressure from his friends and colleagues to take better care of himself and delegate more of his responsibilities. In 1915, Booker T., Washington's health problems culminated in a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. Despite his illness, Washington remained determined to continue his work. However, his ability to function as the dynamic leader of Tuskegee was severely hampered by his condition. In his final months, Washington relied on his closest colleagues to manage the school's daily operations and to carry on his educational mission. His stroke was a clear indication that Washington's health had deteriorated beyond the point of recovery, and the demands of his work had ultimately taken a heavy toll. Despite his declining health, Washington continued to fight for the cause of African American progress until his death. He passed away on November 14, 1915, at the age of 59, leaving behind a legacy of educational reform, economic empowerment, and self-reliance for African Americans. His death marked the end of an era in African American leadership, but his influence continued to reverberate through the institutions he had built and the people whose lives he had touched. Washington's death was mourned by many across the country, both within the African American community and beyond. He was remembered as a leader who had dedicated his life to the upliftment of his people, and who had tirelessly worked to improve the educational and economic conditions of African Americans. Despite the challenges he faced in his later years, Washington's legacy as one of the most important figures in African American history remained secure. His vision of economic self-sufficiency and vocational education had shaped the lives of thousands of African Americans, and his work continued to influence the course of American history for generations to come. Booker T. Washington passed away on November 14, 1915, at the age of 59, after a prolonged battle with his declining health. His death marked the end of a remarkable chapter in American history, one that was defined by his relentless pursuit of economic empowerment, educational progress, and the upliftment of African Americans in the post-Reconstruction era. Washington had dedicated his life to the cause of black education and self-reliance, and though his health had faltered in his final years, his legacy remained strong in the institutions he had built and the millions of lives he had touched. The immediate aftermath of Washington's death was one of widespread mourning, not only within the African American community but also across the nation. His passing was recognized as the loss of a leader who had played a pivotal role in shaping the future of African Americans in a racially segregated society. His work at Tuskegee Institute, his contributions to the advancement of vocational education, and his efforts to build a black middle class had made a lasting impact on the educational and social landscape of America. In the days following his death, tributes poured in from across the country. Many prominent figures, both black and white, expressed their admiration for Washington's work and the legacy he'd left behind. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, who had both worked closely with Washington, praised his contributions to the country. Roosevelt, in particular, had respected Washington for his ability to bridge the gap between black Americans and white Americans, and he described Washington as a great educator who had done more to help his race than any other man. Similarly, Taft expressed his admiration for Washington's work at Tuskegee and his commitment to improving the lives of African Americans. Washington's death also prompted a significant outpouring of recognition from the African American community. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who had often disagreed with Washington's approach, acknowledged Washington's contributions to the development of black education and his role in creating the framework for African American progress in the early 20th century. Though Du Bois and Washington had clashed ideologically, Du Bois recognized the significance of Washington's work in shaping the trajectory of African American leadership. He wrote that Washington had done much for the Negro, but the day had passed when the gospel of patience and silence was adequate for the demands of his people. The tributes paid to Washington reflected the complex legacy he left behind. To many African Americans, Washington was a hero who had helped to lay the groundwork for future generations of black leaders. His emphasis on vocational training and self-reliance had empowered thousands of African Americans to overcome the challenges of a segregated society. For others, however, particularly those who had been critical of his more accommodationist approach, Washington's legacy was viewed with ambivalence. Washington's refusal to push for full political and civil rights, his focus on gradual progress, and his emphasis on working within the existing racial framework had earned him significant criticism, particularly from the more radical wing of the civil rights movement. Washington's death also had an immediate impact on Tuskegee Institute. Under his leadership, Tuskegee had grown from a small, struggling school to one of the most respected institutions for black education in the country. In the wake of his passing, the school's leadership passed to Robert R. Moton, one of Washington's trusted colleagues, who had been trained at Tuskegee and had served as Washington's assistant. Moton, who had been a prominent figure in Washington's educational efforts, was seen as a natural successor. He took over the role of president with a deep commitment to continuing Washington's work and advancing the mission of the school. Moton's leadership helped ensure that Tuskegee remained a leading institution for African American education in the years following Washington's death. In the years immediately following Washington's death, his legacy continued to shape the direction of African American education and activism. Many of the institutions he had helped establish, including Tuskegee, continued to thrive under the guidance of leaders who had been influenced by Washington's teachings. His emphasis on vocational education, economic self-sufficiency, and hard work remained central to the philosophy of many black educators and leaders, even as the civil rights movement began to take on new forms of political engagement. Despite the challenges posed by the racial climate of the time, Washington's influence in the African American community remained strong. His ideas about education, self-reliance, and gradual progress became the foundation for many of the educational institutions and organizations that would play a central role in the fight for civil rights in the 20th century. His work had laid the groundwork for the leadership of future figures like Philip Randolph, who would advocate for labor rights and social justice, and the leaders of the NAACP, who would push for the legal and political equality of African Americans. Washington's death also prompted a broader reflection on the state of race relations in America. His leadership had been focused on the practicalities of African American advancement in a deeply segregated society, and his emphasis on economic self-sufficiency had provided a way for African Americans to assert their dignity in a time when political equality seemed out of reach. Yet, as the civil rights movement gathered momentum in the decades after his death, his more conservative approach came to be seen as insufficient for the new generation of activists who were demanding full political and social rights. While Washington's contributions to education and economic progress were universally acknowledged, his legacy remained a subject of debate. Some viewed him as a figure who had compromised too much with the prevailing racial order, while others saw him as a visionary who had laid the foundation for the economic and educational progress of African Americans in an oppressive society. Washington's death marked the end of one era in African American leadership, but his influence continued to shape the direction of the struggle for equality and justice for years to come. Booker T. Washington's legacy, while marked by both admiration and controversy, remains one of the most significant in African American history. As the founder of Tuskegee Institute and a leader of the African American community in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Washington shaped the trajectory of education, economic empowerment, and racial politics for generations of Black Americans. His emphasis on vocational education, economic self-reliance, and gradual progress became the cornerstone of his leadership, influencing not only his contemporaries but also future generations of African American leaders. Washington's philosophy of self-help and his emphasis on vocational education were designed to equip African Americans with the tools they needed to navigate a deeply segregated society. He believed that economic independence was the key to earning the respect of white Americans and eventually achieving full civil rights. His advocacy for vocational and industrial education was rooted in the belief that African Americans could best improve their lives by developing practical skills that would enable them to enter the workforce and build wealth. Under Washington's leadership, Tuskegee Institute became a model for Black education, particularly in the South. The school's focus on practical hands-on training in fields such as agriculture, carpentry, and mechanics provided students with the skills they needed to support themselves and their families. Tuskegee also became a symbol of Black achievement, demonstrating that African Americans were capable of excelling in a society that often denied them opportunities for education and economic advancement. Washington's ability to secure financial support from white philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller was instrumental in the growth of Tuskegee and other Black institutions. His diplomatic skills and willingness to work within the existing racial hierarchy allowed him to gain the support of influential white leaders who saw him as a pragmatic figure who could help bring about positive change for African Americans. This ability to build relationships with white elites helped Washington achieve lasting success and expand his vision of economic self-sufficiency for Black Americans. However, Washington's legacy is also a subject of debate. His emphasis on gradual progress and his willingness to accept segregation and disenfranchisement in the short term drew sharp criticism from leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that Washington's approach was too accommodating to the prevailing racial order. Du Bois, along with others in the civil rights movement, argued that Washington's focus on vocational training and economic self-reliance distracted from the urgent need for political rights and social equality. Du Bois's call for immediate political and civil rights, higher education, and direct confrontation with racial inequality stood in contrast to Washington's vision of patient incremental change. Despite this criticism, Washington's influence on African American education and economic progress cannot be overstated. His model of education, which combined academic learning with practical training, provided a pathway for thousands of African Americans to improve their lives and build a more self-sufficient community. Washington's vision of economic independence through vocational training was especially important in the post-Reconstruction South, where racial discrimination and limited opportunities for African Americans created significant barriers to upward mobility. Tuskegee Institute, under Washington's leadership, became a beacon of hope and a symbol of African American resilience and determination. Washington's impact extended beyond education. He played a key role in shaping the discourse on race relations in America, using his influence to advocate for policies that would benefit African Americans. As an advisor to U.S. presidents, Washington worked to secure support for Black institutions and promoted the idea that economic progress rather than political agitation, was the path to social equality. His pragmatic approach to race relations was a reflection of his understanding of the realities faced by African Americans in the segregated South. While his philosophy of gradualism was criticized by some, it resonated with many who believed that economic success was the key to gaining respect and dignity in a society that denied them full political rights. Washington's contributions to the rise of black entrepreneurship also formed a key part of his legacy. His advocacy for economic self-sufficiency through business ownership helped lay the foundation for the development of a black middle class. The creation of the National Negro Business League in 1900 was one of Washington's most significant achievements in this regard, as it encouraged the growth of black businesses and provided a platform for African American entrepreneurs to network, share resources, and advocate for policies that would help their businesses thrive. Washington's emphasis on entrepreneurship and business development helped to empower African Americans economically and set the stage for the future growth of black businesses across the country. While Washington's leadership was instrumental in the development of African American education and economic self-reliance, his legacy is also tied to the complexities of the racial and political landscape of his time. His emphasis on vocational education and economic progress was seen by some as a necessary response to the realities of segregation, but others believed that it was insufficient in the face of the urgent need for full civil rights and social equality. The debates surrounding Washington's philosophy of gradualism versus Du Bois' call for immediate political and civil rights reflect the broader tensions within the African American community about how best to achieve social and political equality. In the years following Washington's death, his vision of vocational education and economic self-reliance continued to shape the direction of African American leadership. Even as the civil rights movement began to gain momentum, Washington's legacy lived on through the institutions he built, the people he mentored, and the ideas he championed. His emphasis on education, economic self-sufficiency, and respectability continued to influence African American leaders who sought to empower their communities through practical means. While Washington's approach to race relations was often seen as a compromise by more radical activists, his legacy as an educator and advocate for African American progress remains a cornerstone of American history. Washington's contributions to the advancement of black education, the development of black businesses, and the promotion of self-reliance continue to resonate in the ongoing struggle for racial equality and social justice. In the end, Booker T. Washington's legacy is one of resilience, pragmatism, and vision. He was a leader who, despite the many challenges he faced, dedicated his life to uplifting his people through education and economic empowerment. His impact on African American education, entrepreneurship, and race relations shaped the course of American history, and his work continues to inspire those who believe in the power of education and hard work as tools for social change. Booker T. Washington's philosophy and approach to African American progress were subject to intense scrutiny during his lifetime, and in the years following his death, his legacy continued to be a matter of considerable debate. While Washington's ideas about vocational education, economic self-reliance, and gradual progress earned him praise from many white Americans and some black leaders, they were also criticized by others, particularly those in the more radical wings of the African American civil rights movement. The evolution of Washington's legacy over time reflects the changing political, social, and educational landscape of the 20th century and the broader struggle for civil rights and equality. In the decades following Washington's death in 1915, his legacy was re-evaluated by both African Americans and scholars of American history. His vision of self-reliance and his emphasis on vocational education, which had been considered revolutionary in his time, were increasingly seen as insufficient for addressing the growing demands for full civil rights and political participation. The rise of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and others, shifted the focus of African American activism toward legal and political equality, and Washington's call for gradual, economic-based progress came to be seen as outdated by many younger activists. One of the most significant challenges to Washington's legacy came from W.E.B. Du Bois and his followers, who had long criticized Washington's emphasis on vocational training and his willingness to work within the constraints of segregation. Du Bois, who believed that Washington's approach was too accommodating to white supremacy, argued that African Americans should demand their rights immediately through political action, higher education, and direct confrontation with racial inequality. Du Bois' perspective, which became more prominent in the early 20th century, directly contrasted with Washington's more conservative stance. Du Bois and others in the civil rights movement believed that Washington's focus on vocational education and economic self-sufficiency failed to address the urgent need for African Americans to secure their full civil rights, including the right to vote, the right to equal treatment under the law, and the right to participate fully in American society. They argued that Washington's approach would perpetuate racial inequality by keeping Black Americans in subordinate economic positions and by accepting segregation and disenfranchisement as temporary conditions. Du Bois, along with other activists, called for immediate political and social change, and the civil rights movement came to embrace the idea that full equality could only be achieved through the elimination of segregation and the expansion of political rights. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 20th century, Washington's more conservative philosophy began to be viewed with increasing skepticism. His emphasis on vocational training, which had been an effective response to the limited educational opportunities available to African Americans during his lifetime, was seen by some as a failure to challenge the deeply entrenched systems of racial segregation and discrimination. The push for desegregation, voting rights, and political activism led many to view Washington's focus on economic self-reliance as a compromise that did not address the root causes of racial inequality. However, despite the criticisms, Washington's legacy continued to have a lasting impact on African American education and economic empowerment. His contributions to the development of Black colleges and universities, his role in promoting vocational education, and his emphasis on the importance of hard work and discipline laid the foundation for the advancement of Black communities in the early 20th century. Tuskegee Institute, under Washington's leadership, became one of the most important institutions for Black education in the country, and its model of industrial and vocational training influenced countless other schools across the South. In the mid-20th century, as the civil rights movement gained traction, and African Americans began to push for full political and social equality, Washington's ideas about gradual progress and vocational education were viewed as too conservative. However, there was still recognition of the value of his work in promoting African American education and economic independence. Washington's legacy was increasingly seen as part of a broader historical continuum, one that included figures like Du Bois, who advocated for political and social equality, and later civil rights leaders who sought to dismantle the system of segregation. By the late 20th century, Washington's approach was being re-evaluated not only by civil rights leaders, but also by scholars of American history. Many historians and educators began to recognize Washington's contributions to African American education as foundational, even if his methods were seen as outdated in light of later developments in the civil rights movement. Washington's work at Tuskegee and his ability to secure funding and resources for Black institutions were lauded as critical achievements that helped set the stage for the successes of the civil rights movement. His vision of education as a means of self-empowerment and his ability to create an enduring educational institution like Tuskegee Institute were recognized as groundbreaking in an era when Black Americans had few educational opportunities. In the context of contemporary African American thought, Washington's legacy remains a subject of debate. His approach to race relations, focused on accommodation and self-reliance, has been both praised for its pragmatism and criticized for its perceived failure to challenge the institutionalized racism of his time. Washington's legacy is often viewed as a reflection of the realities of the post-Reconstruction South, where political activism seemed impractical and economic self-sufficiency was seen as the most achievable goal for African Americans. His influence on African American education, particularly in vocational and industrial training, is still felt today, as his ideas about the importance of practical education continue to shape discussions on how best to prepare young people for success in a changing economy. Ultimately, Booker T. Washington's legacy is multifaceted. He was a visionary leader who built institutions, created opportunities, and helped to establish the foundation for the future progress of African Americans. While his approach to racial equality and civil rights may have been seen as limited or conservative in later years, his impact on education and economic empowerment continues to resonate. Washington's contributions to African American education, his ability to create and sustain institutions like Tuskegee Institute, and his advocacy for economic self-reliance remain central to understanding the trajectory of African American advancement in the post-Reconstruction Booker T. Washington's influence on the field of education, particularly in the African American community, remains one of his most enduring legacies. As the founder and leader of Tuskegee Institute, Washington pioneered an educational philosophy that combined academic learning with vocational training, offering a model of education that aimed to equip African Americans with the skills necessary to thrive in a segregated society. While his approach has been debated over time, Washington's impact on American education, both for Black Americans and in the broader context, cannot be overstated. Washington's educational philosophy was rooted in his belief that economic self-sufficiency was the key to achieving social equality. His emphasis on vocational education was a direct response to the educational realities of his time. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many African Americans in the South had limited access to higher education, and the opportunities available to them were often restricted to menial labor or domestic service. Washington's solution was to create an education system that would provide practical skills, such as agriculture, carpentry, and mechanics, alongside traditional academic subjects. He saw this approach as a way to empower African Americans economically and socially, giving them the means to support themselves and in turn gain the respect of white Americans. Tuskegee Institute, under Washington's leadership, became the embodiment of his educational philosophy. Washington worked tirelessly to expand the school and make it a model of black education, even though he faced significant financial challenges and opposition from critics who believed his focus on vocational training was too limited. Despite these obstacles, Washington's leadership ensured that Tuskegee grew into one of the most respected institutions for African American education. The school became a symbol of black achievement and a place where students could receive both the intellectual education and practical training that would prepare them for successful lives. Washington's influence on education extended far beyond Tuskegee. His educational model became a blueprint for many other schools and institutions across the South and the nation. The focus on practical, hands-on training helped thousands of African Americans acquire skills that would provide economic opportunities and improve their social standing. Washington's advocacy for vocational education was widely recognized by both black and white leaders of the time, and his ideas about the importance of education for economic progress laid the groundwork for future educational reforms. In addition to his work at Tuskegee, Washington's leadership helped establish several other educational institutions for African Americans. His efforts to secure funding from white philanthropists and industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and others allowed Washington to expand his vision of vocational education across the nation. Washington was instrumental in raising money for the development of other black schools and colleges, ensuring that the idea of practical vocational training for African Americans would continue to spread throughout the country. Washington's influence on education also had a lasting impact on African American women. By providing access to vocational education for black women, Washington helped empower them to contribute to their families and communities in meaningful ways. Women were trained in domestic skills like cooking, sewing, and nursing, which allowed them to earn a living and gain financial independence. This emphasis on education for women was a crucial step in breaking down the barriers that had traditionally limited women's opportunities. Washington's educational philosophy provided African American women with the tools they needed to build stronger lives for themselves and their families, even in the face of societal constraints. While Washington's educational model was widely praised for its practical focus, it was also met with criticism. His emphasis on vocational training and gradual progress was seen by many, particularly the more radical members of the African American community, as insufficient for achieving full civil rights. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who advocated for higher education and immediate political action, believed that Washington's approach reinforced the racial hierarchy and kept African Americans in subordinate positions. Du Bois argued that the push for political rights, higher education, and full civil rights should take precedence over vocational training, which he believed would limit Black Americans' potential. Despite the criticism, Washington's educational model proved to be remarkably influential. His work helped to create an educational foundation for generations of African Americans, and his ideas about vocational training and economic self-reliance continued to shape the direction of Black education well into the 20th century. Even as the civil rights movement gained momentum and the focus shifted toward political activism, Washington's vision of economic independence through education remained an important part of the conversation about how best to uplift the African American community. Washington's contributions to American education were not limited to his work with African Americans. His model of vocational education, which emphasized the importance of practical skills in fields like agriculture, mechanics, and business, was eventually adopted by many schools and institutions that served all students, regardless of race. Washington's educational philosophy was one of the precursors to the broader movement toward technical and vocational education that became more prominent in the mid-20th century. Moreover, Washington's legacy continued to influence educational reforms well beyond his lifetime. The expansion of vocational education, the establishment of Black colleges and universities, and the push for greater access to education for African Americans all owed much to the groundwork laid by Washington. His ideas about the importance of economic self-sufficiency and the need for education that prepared individuals for real-world work continue to resonate in the modern educational landscape. Despite the challenges and controversies surrounding his approach, Booker T. Washington's lasting impact on American education is undeniable. He helped to establish a system of education that empowered African Americans to achieve economic independence and social mobility. His work continues to be recognized as a crucial part of the history of African American education, and his contributions to the development of Black schools and colleges laid the foundation for future generations of leaders, educators, and entrepreneurs. Booker T. Washington's leadership and educational philosophy were deeply connected to the growth of the African American middle class. His emphasis on vocational education, economic self-reliance, and gradual social progress laid the foundation for a class of Black professionals, entrepreneurs, and educators who sought to uplift both themselves and their communities. Washington's model of education helped create opportunities for African Americans to gain the skills necessary to rise economically, but his relationships with the growing African American middle class were complex and often fraught with tension. For much of his life, Washington's approach to African American progress was one that focused on self-help, hard work, and discipline. He believed that vocational training, specifically in trades such as carpentry, agriculture, and industrial work, was the most practical path to empowerment. This philosophy found a receptive audience within the emerging Black middle class, which valued education as a means of gaining social respect and economic independence. Washington's supporters among the African American middle class were often those who believed in a more gradual, non-confrontational approach to racial equality, and his educational institutions, particularly Tuskegee Institute, became pillars of Black education, Tuskegee, with its focus on industrial and agricultural education, produced a significant number of graduates who went on to establish businesses, run schools, and become leaders within their communities. For many, the promise of economic independence through vocational skills was an important step toward achieving a higher social standing. Washington's model of self-reliance allowed the African American middle class to demonstrate their capacity for responsible citizenship and to earn the respect of white Americans who had long denied them opportunities for full participation in society. However, Washington's vision for the middle class was not universally embraced. While his educational philosophy was praised by many African Americans for its focus on practical skills, some leaders of the African American intellectual elite, particularly W.E.B. Du Bois, viewed Washington's emphasis on vocational training as too limited. Du Bois and his supporters argued that the African American middle class needed access to higher education, political power, and the ability to challenge the system of segregation and disenfranchisement. Du Bois saw Washington's approach as a way of pacifying African Americans, allowing them to focus on economic pursuits while avoiding more radical demands for civil rights and political equality. This disagreement between Washington and Du Bois, particularly their differing views on the role of the African American middle class, was one of the most significant ideological debates of the early 20th century. Washington's focus on economic self-sufficiency was seen by many as a way of building a black middle class that could prove its worth to white Americans. But Du Bois, who advocated for higher education and political engagement, believed that the middle class needed to take a more active role in demanding equality and civil rights, rather than acquiescing to the social order. Washington's relationship with the African American middle class was thus shaped by both support and criticism. On one hand, his insistence on vocational training and economic self-sufficiency resonated with those who were looking for practical ways to improve their social standing. On the other hand, his reluctance to challenge the political and social systems that enforced segregation led to dissatisfaction among those who felt that Washington's approach was not enough to break the chains of racial inequality. His message of gradualism and accommodation became increasingly controversial as the civil rights movement gained traction, and African Americans demanded immediate political rights. Despite these tensions, Washington's influence on the African American middle class cannot be understated. His educational initiatives helped to create a class of professionals and business owners who could contribute to their communities and provide leadership in a segregated society. Many of the African American middle class who benefited from Washington's vocational education became pillars of their communities, using their skills to build businesses, teach in schools, and provide much-needed services to Black Americans who had long been excluded from mainstream society. Washington's ability to raise funds from white philanthropists, including Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, also helped expand the educational opportunities available to the black middle class. These philanthropic contributions allowed Washington to establish more schools, increase the scope of vocational training programs, and provide scholarships for African American students. Washington's ability to navigate the complex racial and economic terrain of his time and secure resources for black institutions was a key element in the growth of the African American middle class. His success in this regard allowed many to rise above poverty and attain a degree of respectability that had previously been out of reach. In the long run, the relationship between Washington and the African American middle class became more complicated as the civil rights movement evolved. Washington's pragmatic approach, which emphasized economic progress and vocational education, was increasingly seen as inadequate in the face of growing demands for full civil rights. While Washington's ideas had been practical and effective in an era when political action seemed impossible, by the mid-20th century his vision of gradual progress was being challenged by the civil rights leaders who called for more immediate change. However, Washington's legacy in shaping the African American middle class remained significant. His focus on education, hard work, and self-sufficiency provided African Americans with the tools they needed to thrive in a society that was deeply segregated and economically unequal. His work at Tuskegee Institute and his emphasis on practical education helped to create an enduring model for black empowerment that continued to influence generations of African American leaders. While his approach may have been seen as insufficient for the immediate political challenges of the civil rights movement, Washington's role in creating the foundation for the African American middle class remains an important part of his legacy. Washington's belief in the power of education and vocational training has had a lasting impact on American society as a whole. The emphasis on practical education in fields such as agriculture, mechanics, and business, which Washington championed, has continued to be a key part of the national educational discourse. Washington's influence on the African American middle class was part of a larger movement toward economic independence and educational achievement, and his legacy continues to inspire those who believe that self-reliance, education, and hard work are essential to overcoming adversity. Booker T. Washington's leadership and philosophy were deeply rooted in the realities of the American South, where he spent much of his life and focused his efforts to improve the educational and economic conditions of African Americans. Born in Virginia, Washington's life experiences shaped his perspective on race relations and the need for African Americans to adopt a pragmatic, gradual approach to securing equality in a racially segregated society. His relationship with the South, both personally and professionally, was central to his vision of progress for African Americans. Washington's early experiences in the South deeply influenced his views on race and the role of African Americans in society. Growing up as the child of formerly enslaved parents, Washington was acutely aware of the harsh realities faced by black Americans, especially in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction. He saw the South as a place where racial prejudice and segregation were entrenched, and where the chances of upward mobility for African Americans were limited. These early experiences made Washington a pragmatist, believing that African Americans would have to earn their place in society through hard work, education, and economic self-sufficiency. When Washington became the leader of Tuskegee Institute in 1881, he saw the South as a place where black Americans could make tangible progress, but only through a focus on vocational training and self-improvement. Washington's philosophy of education, which emphasized practical skills and industrial training, was designed to prepare African Americans for the kinds of work that were available to them in a segregated society. He believed that by focusing on economic independence and the development of a skilled workforce, African Americans could improve their social standing in the South, gain respect, and eventually challenge the system of segregation. Washington's ability to build relationships with white Southerners was critical to his success in the region. In an era when racial tension was high and the South was still reeling from the trauma of the Civil War, Washington's diplomatic approach to race relations helped to foster a sense of cooperation between black and white Americans. He understood that white Southern leaders were hesitant to embrace full civil rights for African Americans, and therefore, he worked within the existing racial framework to gain support for his educational initiatives. One of Washington's most significant achievements was his ability to secure financial backing for Tuskegee Institute from wealthy white philanthropists, many of whom were from the South. Through his connections and personal relationships with industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, Washington was able to raise the funds necessary to expand Tuskegee and provide scholarships for students. His success in this area was a testament to his ability to work within the Southern power structure and navigate the complexities of race relations in the post-Reconstruction South. Despite the support Washington received from white Southerners, his relationship with the region was not without tension. Many of Washington's critics, particularly those in the more radical wing of the African American community, saw his efforts to work with white Southern elites as a form of accommodationism. Washington's refusal to directly challenge segregation and his focus on vocational education were seen as a way of appeasing white Southerners and avoiding more confrontational political action. Washington's critics, including W.E.B. Du Bois, argued that his approach would keep African Americans in subordinate positions and prevent them from achieving full civil rights. Yet, Washington's ability to work within the system in the South was, in his view, a necessary strategy for progress. He believed that African Americans could not afford to wait for political and social equality to come through confrontation or legal battles. Instead, he argued that economic success and vocational training were the means by which African Americans could prove their worth to white Southerners and earn the respect that would eventually lead to equality. Washington's relationship with the South also had a significant impact on his influence in the political and social spheres. As an influential leader in the African American community, he was frequently called upon to speak on behalf of Black Americans in the South. His speeches, particularly his famous Atlanta Exposition Address in 1895, were often framed as calls for reconciliation and mutual progress between Black and white Americans. Washington's advocacy for vocational education and self-reliance was designed to appeal to both Black and white audiences, as he believed that economic development was the key to improving the lives of African Americans in a segregated society. In his relationship with the South, Washington also sought to build alliances with white leaders who were sympathetic to the plight of African Americans. He worked with progressive whites who believed that education and economic development were essential for the upliftment of Black Americans. These alliances allowed Washington to gain support for his educational initiatives, even in the face of racial discrimination and segregation. His ability to navigate the political landscape of the South and build these relationships was one of the key reasons why Tuskegee Institute was able to thrive during his leadership. However, Washington's more conciliatory approach to race relations was not universally accepted, even among African Americans in the South. Many Black leaders, particularly those who were more politically active, saw Washington's willingness to cooperate with white Southerners as a betrayal of the struggle for full civil rights. Washington's focus on vocational education was viewed by some as a way of keeping African Americans in subordinate positions, while the more radical Black leaders, like Du Bois, called for higher education and political engagement to advance the cause of civil rights. Despite the criticism, Washington's influence in the South remained strong throughout his life. His ability to build educational institutions, secure financial support, and promote economic independence for African Americans was a significant contribution to the development of Black communities in the region. His work helped lay the foundation for the future growth of African American education, entrepreneurship, and political power in the South. Washington's relationship with the South, therefore, was complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, his diplomatic approach to race relations allowed him to build alliances with white Southerners and secure the resources necessary to expand Tuskegee Institute. On the other hand, his reluctance to challenge segregation and his focus on economic progress rather than political action led to criticism from both Black and white leaders. Ultimately, Washington's legacy in the South is one of pragmatism and gradualism, rooted in his belief that African Americans could best improve their lives through education, self-reliance, and hard work. Booker T. Washington's educational philosophy and leadership shaped African American life for decades after his death in 1915. But as the 20th century progressed and the civil rights movement gained momentum, his legacy was reassessed in light of new demands for equality. While Washington's emphasis on vocational education and economic self-sufficiency had a profound impact on Black communities, it was also criticized by many who believed it didn't go far enough in addressing the political and social inequalities that African Americans were facing. This tension between Washington's gradualist approach and the growing demands for immediate civil rights and political action defined the evolution of his legacy, particularly in relation to the civil rights movement. During the early stages of the civil rights movement, Washington's vision of Black progress through education and economic independence remained influential, especially in the context of African American communities that continued to face extreme economic hardship and segregation. His work at Tuskegee Institute and his emphasis on vocational training laid the groundwork for many of the institutions that would later play a crucial role in advancing the social and economic position of Black Americans. His philosophy of hard work, self-reliance, and the dignity of labor still resonated with many who believed that African Americans could improve their standing through discipline and education. However, as the 20th century progressed, the civil rights movement began to shift away from Washington's philosophy of gradualism toward a more direct confrontation with racial inequality. The movement's leaders, including figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, Philip Randolph, and eventually Martin Luther King Jr., argued that Washington's emphasis on vocational training and self-reliance did not fully address the systemic issues of segregation, disenfranchisement, and discrimination that African Americans were facing. The demand for political rights, legal equality, and the immediate end to segregation became central to the civil rights agenda, leaving Washington's philosophy of incremental change increasingly at odds with the movement's goals. Despite this shift in focus, Washington's legacy was not entirely rejected by civil rights leaders. Many continued to admire his ability to create educational institutions that empowered African Americans and helped build a more self-sufficient black community. Tuskegee Institute, for example, continued to thrive under the leadership of his successors, and his educational philosophy continued to shape the curriculum of many historically black colleges and universities. Washington's emphasis on economic self-sufficiency and entrepreneurship also remained relevant as the black middle class continued to grow, and as African American businesses flourished in the face of segregation. However, Washington's cautious approach to race relations became less relevant as the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1940s and 1950s. By this time, the legal and political struggles for African American equality were coming to the forefront of national attention. The landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, marked a turning point in the civil rights movement. This decision, along with subsequent civil rights legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, reflected the shift toward political action and legal reform that Washington had largely avoided in his lifetime. The leaders of the civil rights movement, such as Martin Luther King Jr., emphasized nonviolent direct action and mass protest as means of achieving full civil rights for African Americans. These leaders often found Washington's philosophy of patient, gradual progress too passive, arguing that the black community needed to demand its rights immediately through political action and public protest. For figures like King, the idea of economic empowerment through vocational education was insufficient without the fundamental guarantee of political and social equality. Washington's philosophy, which sought to work within the system and build respect through economic success, was seen as too conciliatory to the white power structures that maintained segregation and racial oppression. Despite the criticism from civil rights leaders, Washington's ideas about education and economic self-sufficiency continued to influence African American leaders and institutions. His legacy lived on in the work of educators and activists who saw the value in his belief that education could empower African Americans to improve their social and economic standing. His focus on vocational training and business development, though seen as secondary to political activism in the context of the civil rights movement, was seen as an important means of building black communities and providing opportunities for African Americans to achieve a degree of independence and respectability. In the post-civil rights era, Washington's legacy has continued to evolve. His ideas about education and economic self-reliance have been reassessed in light of the ongoing struggles for racial equality, and his legacy is often viewed as a complex combination of both empowerment and accommodation. Scholars and historians continue to debate the efficacy of his approach, weighing the practical achievements of his educational philosophy against the larger goals of civil rights and political equality. Washington's influence on the African American middle class, entrepreneurship, and educational institutions remains undeniable, but his willingness to accept segregation and his focus on vocational training have been critiqued as insufficient responses to the urgent demands for full civil rights. In recent years, Washington's legacy has been revisited through a more critical lens, with many recognizing that his work laid important foundations for the growth of black institutions, even as it also reflected the limitations of his era. His belief in gradualism, while pragmatic in its historical context, has been critiqued by many modern civil rights leaders who seek more immediate and transformative changes. However, his contributions to the development of African American education and his ability to navigate a deeply segregated society remain key parts of the larger story of black progress in America. Washington's legacy, then, is both a reflection of his time and a testament to his vision of black advancement through education and economic empowerment. While his approach was ultimately superseded by the more radical demands of the civil rights movement, his work provided a foundation for the struggles that followed and remains an important chapter in the history of African American leadership. Booker T. Washington's life and work remain one of the most important chapters in the story of African American progress in the United States. His legacy, shaped by a vision of self-reliance, vocational education, and economic empowerment, continues to influence the discourse around race, education, and equality. While his approach was often criticized for being too accommodating to the status quo, Washington's contributions to the development of African American institutions, particularly in the South, cannot be overstated. His work at Tuskegee Institute alone transformed the educational landscape for Black Americans, providing them with the tools and opportunities to rise above the systemic challenges they faced. Washington's philosophy, grounded in the belief that African Americans should focus on economic self-sufficiency and vocational education, was particularly relevant in an era when political equality seemed like a distant dream for black people, especially in the South. Washington's emphasis on hard work, discipline, and practical skills provided a pathway for many African Americans to improve their social and economic conditions and build strong, self-sustaining communities. His ability to secure financial support for Tuskegee and other black institutions through his connections with white philanthropists and political leaders ensured that his vision would reach a broader audience. However, as the civil rights movement gained momentum in the mid-20th century, Washington's legacy came under scrutiny. His philosophy of gradual progress and his willingness to work within the constraints of segregation were increasingly seen as insufficient in the face of the pressing demands for full political rights, social equality, and desegregation. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and later civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. called for immediate action and confrontation with the racial systems of repression that Washington had been willing to accommodate. While Washington's emphasis on education and self-help was still seen as valuable, his reluctance to challenge the racial order directly placed him at odds with the more radical elements of the civil rights movement. Despite these criticisms, Washington's contributions to African American education, economic empowerment, and self-sufficiency remained central to the story of black advancement in America. His work at Tuskegee Institute became a model for other black colleges and schools across the country, and his efforts to promote vocational education helped thousands of African Americans acquire the skills needed to enter the workforce and support their families. Washington's legacy is also deeply tied to the development of black entrepreneurship, as his advocacy for economic self-reliance and business ownership helped lay the groundwork for the growth of a black middle class. As we reflect on Booker T. Washington's life, we must acknowledge both the strengths and limitations of his approach. Washington's focus on vocational education and economic progress provided African Americans with the means to improve their circumstances in a society that often denied them full political and social rights. His legacy is one of resilience, pragmatism, and vision, but it also raises important questions about the role of education, political action, and activism in the struggle for racial equality. Washington's vision of self-reliance and his belief in the transformative power of education remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with issues of racial inequality, economic disparity, and educational access. His work serves as a reminder that progress often requires a combination of practical solutions and strategic leadership, especially when facing systemic barriers to change. While the civil rights movement eventually moved away from Washington's philosophy of gradualism, his influence continues to resonate in the ongoing fight for social and economic justice. Washington's legacy also challenges us to consider the ways in which leadership evolves in response to changing times. While his approach may not have fully addressed the immediate demands for civil rights, his work provided a foundation for future generations of African American leaders to build upon. Washington's contributions to African American education, his efforts to create a more self-sufficient black community, and his ability to navigate the complex racial and political landscape of his time left an indelible mark on the history of African American leadership. In conclusion, Booker T. Washington's life and legacy remind us that the fight for racial equality and social justice is multifaceted, requiring both pragmatic action and bold advocacy. His vision of economic self-sufficiency, vocational education, and gradual progress was an essential part of the African American experience in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While his approach may have been eclipsed by more radical civil rights movements, his contributions to education, entrepreneurship, and community building continue to influence the struggle for equality. Washington's story is one of perseverance, leadership, and a relentless commitment to improving the lives of African Americans in a society that sought to marginalize them. As we look back on Booker T. Washington's legacy, we are reminded of the importance of education, hard work, and self-reliance in overcoming adversity. His work laid the groundwork for the future progress of African Americans and contributed to the ongoing journey toward full equality and justice in America.